Before we go any deeper, subscribe to Vesper Shroud. This channel is dedicated to true horror stories based on real events and real locations in America. Tonight, we're entering Pennsylvania's forests, places where trails don't always lead back out. These are real reports, and the first story already breaks the rules of reality. Story 1. Trail that never ends. Listen, I need to tell you what happened to me. I need someone to know the truth about what is really out there in Pennsylvania's forests. What I experienced isn't something I can keep quiet about anymore. This is the most terrifying, most unsettling thing that has ever happened to me, and I'm still not entirely sure what I encountered. But I am going to tell you everything. It started on a Saturday morning in October. Fall was turning the trees into fire, and the weather was perfect. I am a serious hiker, not some casual day tripper. I logged over 300 trail miles across the Northeast. I know how to read maps. I understand terrain. I respect the wilderness. That matters because what I'm about to describe shouldn't be possible. And yet it happened to me. I drove up to Rothrick State Forest, about 2 hours north of where I live. The place is massive, and it was easy to find solitude there. That was exactly what I wanted. I parked my truck at the ranger station parking lot, checked the trail map on the bulletin board, and chose what looked like a simple loop. The sign said it was marked clearly with blue blazes. 4 miles total, should take me about 90 minutes, maybe 2 hours at a leisurely pace. The first mile felt wonderful. The air was crisp and cold, that perfect kind of autumn cold that makes you feel alive. I could hear my boots crunching on the leaf-covered path, the sound of dried leaves under my feet creating this peaceful rhythm. The forest surrounded me completely. Tall oaks and hemlocks blocked out most of the sky, and everything was quiet except for the occasional bird call echoing through the creepy canopy above. Around mile 1, I spotted the first blue blaze painted on a tree. It was bright blue, fresh looking, exactly as it should be. I checked my watch. I was making good time. The trail wound deeper into the forest, and I felt that familiar hiking contentment settling over me. This was why I came out here. This solitude, this immersion in nature, this escape from my normal life. But something started to feel off after about 40 minutes. I passed another blue blaze about 15 minutes earlier, and now I was expecting to see another. The trail seemed to follow a pattern in my mind, and I was waiting for the next marker to appear. When I finally did spot it, my stomach gave a small lurch. It was the same tree, not the same type of tree, the same actual tree. I remember it specifically because there was a distinctive scar on the bark, an old wound that had healed over, leaving this odd, almost face-like pattern in the white wood. My first thought was that I'd gone in a circle somehow. That's the creepy thing about getting lost in the forest. Your mind immediately starts playing tricks on you, but I knew I'd been walking in a relatively straight line. I'd been paying attention to the terrain. I hadn't to double back. So I marked the time and kept walking, figuring the trail must loop around in a way I didn't expect. I walked for another 20 minutes, carefully watching the forest floor, keeping an eye out for the next blue blaze. When it appeared, I felt my skin actually prickle with goosebumps. It was the scar tree again, that same distinctive, unsettling, face-like pattern in the bark. The same blue blaze, faded at almost exactly the same spot. This didn't make sense. This was impossible. I'd been walking deliberately forward. I was certain I hadn't turned around, but somehow I was right back where I started my second segment of the trail. My hands felt cold, and not from the autumn air. I pulled out my phone to check the time, and that's when I realized something even more disturbing. My battery showed a full charge, but the last time I checked it was at 30%. I knew I hadn't charged it since I left my house. But there it was on my screen, showing 100% battery. That impossible fact unsettled me more than the repeating trees somehow. I decided to try something different. Instead of following the blue blazes, I would navigate by my phone, GPS. I opened my Maps app and set a waypoint at the ranger station. Then I turned 90 degrees off the trail, pushing through brush and undergrowth, deliberately trying to navigate around this impossible loop that kept bringing me back to the same tree. Walking off trail through a forest isn't advisable, especially in unfamiliar territory. Branches grab at you, the terrain becomes treacherous, your foot can turn on a root hidden under leaves, and suddenly you re-injured in the middle of nowhere. I knew the risks, but something terrifying was happening. and I needed to escape this creepy loop. For about 10 minutes, I pushed through, following my phone's GPS arrow back toward the ranger station. The forest here was denser, darker, the trees pressing in closer. I could feel my heart rate climbing. This was no longer a pleasant hike. This was something else entirely. Something that made my instinct scream at me that I was in danger, real danger, even though nothing was actually attacking me. That's when I came back out onto the trail, but it wasn't a different section of trail. When I looked down and saw the blue blaze painted on the tree in front of me, my blood ran cold. I knew exactly which tree it was. I'd passed it dozens of times now. The distinctive scar, the face-like pattern, the exact same blue blaze in the exact same spot. I was back at my nightmare tree again. This time I felt genuine panic rising in my chest. My breathing became shallow. Sweat was running down my back despite the cold air. Something about this wasn't too natural. Something about what was happening was deeply, fundamentally wrong. The kind of wrong that makes your primitive brain recognize danger even when your conscious mind doesn't, to understand what is happening. I tried again. I went in a completely different direction, this time walking deliberately northeast according to my phone's compass. I hiked hard for 15 minutes, really pushing myself, my boots thundering on the forest floor, branches tearing at my jacket. I was sweating now, terrified, knowing something haunting was unfolding around me. And when I finally stopped to catch my breath, to look at my phone and see my progress, I could see the ranger station marker on my GPS screen. It was showing me less than half a mile away. But that was wrong. I should have covered nearly 2 miles. I should be getting closer. Instead, the numbers barely changed from where I started. I pulled up my trail history, the little breadcrumb line that shows where my phone has been. And this is the part that made my hands literally shake. The line didn't show me walking in straight lines through the forest. It showed a tight, repetitive spiral pattern, over and over, small loops that barely covered any real distance. It looked like I'd been walking in circles the entire time, but I knew I hadn't. I was certain I was going forward. The forest around me suddenly felt hostile. The shadows between the trees seemed darker than they should be. The creepy silence of the forest, that absence of bird songs and animal sounds, pressed down on me like something physical. This was no longer an eerie hike. This was a nightmare scenario unfolding in real time. I was lost in a way that didn't make rational sense, trapped in a place that seemed to be deliberately keeping me from leaving. I checked my phone battery. Somehow it had dropped to 70%, even though I checked it when it read 100 just minutes ago. Time felt wrong too. I thought I'd been hiking for maybe 2 hours total, but my phone showed it was almost 5 in the afternoon. I'd lost hours, entire hours, and I had no memory of where they went. That is when the shadow appeared. It was subtle at first, just a sense that I was being watched. That feeling you get when someone is staring at the back of your neck. I turned around quickly, my heart jumping, but there was nothing there except trees and undergrowth and creepy shadows that seemed to stretch longer than they should have. But the feeling didn't go away. It intensified. It felt like something was moving at the edge of my vision, something dark that would disappear whenever I looked directly at it. I started walking again, faster this time, trying not to admit to myself that I was scared. I was more than scared. I was terrified. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow made me think something was there, something waiting, something terrible was following me through this dark and eerie forest. The trees started to look the same, not just the scar tree, but all of them. Every oak started to look like the last oak. Every hemlock started to blend together. The landscape became a repetitive nightmare of trunks and branches and darkness. I couldn't tell if I was walking deeper into the forest or if I was still trapped in that impossible spiral my phone had recorded. I could feel panic taking over now, pushing logic aside. My breathing was rapid, almost hyperventilation. My legs felt weak. Everything in me wanted to run, but I knew running in a forest was how people got really injured. So I walked faster, my eyes darting everywhere, looking for something, anything that might be different, anything that might prove I was making progress. Then I saw it, a landmark I recognized, a massive rock outcropping that jutted up from the forest floor, covered in moss and creepy lichen. I remembered passing this exact rock earlier in my hike, way before I got trapped in the repeating loop. It was a good sign. It meant I was navigating back toward the beginning of the trail. But as I got closer to it, I realized something horrifying. There was another rock just like it, about 50 yards to the left, identical in size and shape. And looking around, I could see more rocks appearing in the forest, all of them similar, all of them covered in the same kind of moss and lichen. They looked ancient, like they'd been sitting in this forest for thousands of years, slowly being claimed by nature. Had they always been there? Had I just not noticed them before? Or was the forest changing around me, duplicating landmarks, creating false familiarity to confuse me further? I made a decision then. I decided I wasn't going to try to navigate anymore. I was going to stay in one place and make myself visible. I would call for help. I would stay put and let someone find me. That was the reasonable thing to do. That was what all the safety guides said. I found a small clearing where I could be seen from the air if a helicopter passed overhead. I sat down on a fallen log, pulled out my phone, and tried to make a call to 911. The signal was terrible, flickering in and out, but I managed to connect. I told the dispatcher I was lost in Rothrick State Forest, that I needed help, that something strange was happening and I couldn't to explain it, but I needed rescuers to find me. The dispatcher asked for my GPS coordinates. I read them off. Then she asked me to stay on the line while she contacted the local ranger station. There was a long silence. When she came back, her voice sounded confused. She said the coordinates I'd given her were outside the state forest. They were in a residential neighborhood about 5 miles away. She asked me if I was sure about my location. I pulled up my maps again, looking at where my phone was showing me. The coordinates matched exactly. This was impossible. I could see the forest all around me. I could feel the cold. I could hear the wind through the trees. I was definitely in the forest. But my phone was insisting I was in a suburban neighborhood that I'd driven past on the way to the park. I hung up the phone. I don't know why. I should have stayed on the line. But something made me panic and disconnect the call. That's when the shadows really started to move. I could see them now, moving between the trees, dark silhouettes that weren't quite right. They weren't the shadows cast by sunlight. They were something else. They moved independently of any visible light source. They flowed across the forest floor like living things, like water, creeping closer and closer to where I was sitting. I tried to run. This time I didn't care about the risks. I just ran, crashing through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face, thorns tearing at my skin. I could hear something behind me, something that sounded like rustling leaves, but wrong somehow, like the sound was coming from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. The terrifying realization hit me that I wasn't running from something in the forest. I was running from the forest itself. The forest was hunting me. Everything felt alive now, hostile, deliberately trying to prevent me from leaving. The terrain suddenly became treacherous. Roots appeared in my path at exactly the wrong moment. The ground became uneven. Every step threatened to twist my ankle or send me crashing down. The nightmare continued, escalating, becoming more surreal and more disturbing with each passing minute. I came bursting out onto a road. It was sudden and shocking. 1 second enclosed in the creepy dark forest and the next standing on asphalt in the fading evening light. A road I didn't recognize. I looked at my phone, GPS again with trembling hands. It showed me exactly where I was. At a highway I'd never been on, about 20 miles south of the ranger station. I made it out. I was alive. I was out of that horrifying forest, but I couldn't explain what had happened. I was covered in cuts and scratches. My clothes were torn. I lost my water bottle somewhere in the nightmare run. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. My heart was still racing from the terror of those moving shadows. A car pulled over to help me. An older woman who saw me stumbling on the roadside like some kind of escaped lunatic. She gave me water and let me call for help. The state police eventually came and picked me up. They were professional but clearly suspicious. They wanted to know what I'd been doing, why I looked like I'd been in a fight, why my story didn't make any sense. I told them about the repeating trail, the impossible GPS readings, the shadows that moved with intention. They listened politely. Then one of them asked to see my phone. He looked at the GPS history. He looked at my battery drain. He looked at the timestamps on all my photos. Everything was normal. The GPS showed a clear path, no loops, no spirals. Just a reasonable hiking route that made sense. My photos showed a timeline that was consistent with a normal hiking trip. The battery drain was exactly what you'd expect from normal use. There was no evidence that anything unusual had happened at all. But I knew what I experienced. I know what I felt. And I know what I saw. Those dark, terrifying shadows moving through the forest with some kind of horrible, eerie intelligence. I tried to research what happened to me. They read accounts from other hikers who they experienced similar things in Pennsylvania's forests, and they found them scattered across internet forums and hiking boards. They found reports from people who they've been trapped in repeating loops, hikers who they lost hours with no explanation, people who they've seen shadows that shouldn't to exist, moving with purpose through the darkness. The Pennsylvania hiking community has an unofficial nickname for it. They call it the trail that never ends. And apparently, I'm not the first person to find it. What terrifies me most is this. I never found that trail on any official map. When I tried to go back to the ranger station and describe exactly where I started my hike, the ranger looked at me with something between pity and fear. She told me there was no trail like that in Rotherham State Forest. There was no marked blue loop that started from that particular parking area. It didn't exist. But it felt so real, and I've never forgotten it. Every time I see a forest now, I feel that same dread creeping up my spine. I think about those repeating landmarks. I think about the hours I can to account for. I think about those shadows moving with that terrible, creepy intelligence through the darkness. The worst part, the thing that keeps me awake at night, is this simple, horrifying question. If that trail doesn't exist, if I never actually hiked it according to all the evidence, then where was I? Where did I spend those missing hours? And if it doesn't exist in our world, then where does it exist? That question haunts me more than the experience itself, because if the trail that never ends is real, if other hikers have found it, then it's still out there. It's still waiting. And somewhere in Pennsylvania is forests, in the dark spaces between the trees, in the places where GPS loses its way and time becomes meaningless. Something is waiting for the next person foolish enough to follow the blue blazes. I've stopped hiking. I can to go back into the forest. Just the thought of those shadows, that eerie silence, that creepy sensation of being trapped in a place that doesn't exist but feels more real than anything else, fills me with an unsettling dread I can shake. But sometimes I wonder if I ever really left at all. Sometimes I look at my hands, and I wonder if the scratches and cuts are from running through branches in the real world, or if they re something else entirely. Something that exists in that place between where I was and where I ended up. And on quiet nights, when I'm alone in my house and the wind is blowing through the trees outside, I can almost hear that sound again. That rustling, that creepy, wrong sound of something moving through the forest. Getting closer, always getting closer. I don't know if I'm still lost. I don't know if I ever really escaped, but I know one thing for certain. I will never go back to Pennsylvania's forests. Because somewhere out there, the trail that never ends is still waiting. And it's still hunting. This is my testimony. This is my terrifying account of what happened to me. And if you ever see a trail marked with blue blazes in Pennsylvania that doesn't appear on any official map, I'm begging you, don't follow it. Because once you start walking that path, you might never find your way back to the world you thought was real. Some trails are meant to be left untraveled. Some shadows are meant to remain in the darkness. And some places, some creepy, eerie, unsettling places, are better left undiscovered. That's the truth about the trail that never ends. Story 2. Something answered from the trees. I never believed in anything I couldn't explain until I spent 3 nights alone in the Allegheny Forest in northern Pennsylvania. What I heard out there still wakes me up at night, and I need you to understand something before I tell you what happened. Whatever's in those woods, it knows you. It knows your voice, and it will use it against you. I am a wildlife sound engineer. My job is to record natural environments for documentaries and research projects. They camped in grizzly country, recorded storms in the Everglades, and spent weeks in the Pacific Northwest rainforests. They heard elk bugling at dawn, wolves howling under full moons, and the unsettling screams of mountain lions. I know what belongs in the woods and what doesn't. That is why I can tell you with complete certainty that what I encountered in Pennsylvania was not an animal. It was something else, something horrifying. The assignment seemed routine. A university research team wanted baseline audio recordings from a remote section of the Allegheny National Forest. They received scattered reports from hikers and campers about unusual sounds, voices calling out in the darkness, strange echoes that didn't match the terrain. The researchers suspected it was just acoustic anomalies, maybe some rare bird species, perhaps even elaborate pranks. They needed documentation. I needed the paycheck, so I packed my recording equipment, my tent, and enough supplies for a week, and I drove into the forest on a cold October morning. The trailhead was empty. A single wooden sign marked the path, weathered and leaning slightly to one left. The parking area held only my truck. No other vehicles, no other people. The Forest Service ranger I contacted hadn't. He seemed concerned. Just mentioned that this particular area didn't get much traffic. Too remote, too dense. People preferred to maintain trails closer to the main roads. That should have been my first warning. The hike-in took 4 hours. The canopy grew thicker with each mile, the trees pressing closer together, their branches weaving overhead until the sky became a distant memory. Oak and maple gave way to pine and hemlock. The temperature dropped. The air grew heavy with the smell of damp earth and rotting leaves. I remember thinking how quiet it was. Not peaceful quiet, empty quiet. I'd been walking for hours and hadn't heard a single bird call. No squirrels rustling through the underbrush. No insects buzzing. Just my footsteps and my breathing and the creaking of old trees swaying in a wind I couldn't feel. I made camp in a small clearing about 2 miles from the nearest marked trail. Perfect isolation for quality recordings. I set up my tent, arranged my equipment, and placed my primary microphones in a wide circle around the campsite, about 50 yards out in each direction. These were professional-grade sensors designed to pick up sounds across multiple frequencies, from deep infrasonic rumbles to ultrasonic pitches beyond human hearing. If anything moved or made noise within 200 yards, I'd capture it. The first night passed without incident. I recorded hours of environmental sound, wind patterns, branch movements, the occasional rustle that might have been a small animal, though I never saw one. I reviewed the audio files before sleeping, listening through headphones, isolating and identifying each sound. Everything seemed normal, unremarkable, maybe too unremarkable for a healthy forest ecosystem, but nothing scary, nothing disturbing. Not yet. The second night changed everything. I was sitting by my campfire around 9:30, reviewing that evening's recordings, when I heard my name. Clear as day. My actual name, called out from somewhere in the darkness beyond the firelight. A man's voice. Not shouting, but speaking at normal volume, like someone standing 20 feet away trying to get my attention. I froze. My skin went cold. I pulled off my headphones and listened. The forest was silent. I called out, asked if someone was there, if they needed help. My voice sounded small and swallowed by the trees. No response. I waited 5 minutes. Nothing. I convinced myself I imagined it, that I'd been listening to recordings for so long that my brain had conjured phantom sounds. I put my headphones back on. Then I heard it in the recording. My name, spoken clearly, but wrong. The voice was mine. My exact voice, my inflection, my tone, but I hadn't said my name. I'd been silent when it was recorded. The timestamp showed it had been captured by the eastern microphone, the one I'd placed deep in the trees. I played it again, and again. Each time, the creepy wrongness of it grew worse. It was my voice calling to me from the forest. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire with my back against a tree, watching the darkness, listening. Part of me wanted to pack up and hike out immediately, but the rational part of my brain insisted there had to be an explanation. Some acoustic phenomenon. Maybe someone playing a prank. Maybe my equipment had malfunctioned. I needed daylight to investigate. When dawn finally came, gray and cold, I checked all my microphones. They were functioning perfectly. No tampering, no damage. I reviewed every second of audio from the previous night. At 11:17, the eastern microphone had picked up my name and my voice. At 11:42, the northern microphone caught it. Same voice, same inflection. At 1:15 in the morning, the southern microphone recorded it. Each time from a different direction. Each time getting closer to my camp. The chilling realization hit me like ice water. Something had been circling me, using my voice, calling to me. I should have left. Every instinct screamed at me to pack my gear and get out. But I am a scientist at heart, and scientists need evidence. I needed to know what this was. I convinced myself to stay one more night. I set up additional recording equipment. I repositioned microphones. I prepared myself mentally for whatever might happen. I told myself I was ready. I wasn't ready. That third night, it started just after sunset. Whispers, dozens of them, coming from every direction. I could hear them with my naked ears. Soft and sibilant, weaving through the trees. They weren't words, just sounds, breath and friction, and something that might have been laughter. The microphones picked them up clearly. I sat in my tent with my headphones on, listening in real time, trying to identify the source. The audio software showed the sounds weren't coming from animals. The frequency patterns were wrong. The rhythm was wrong. They were too organized, too purposeful. Then the whispers became words. My words, phrases I spoken earlier that day. Testing. 1, 2, 3. Audio levels look good. Nothing unusual so far, but scrambled and overlapping and coming from multiple locations simultaneously. My voice echoing through the forest in impossible ways. Sentences I recorded myself speaking played back at me from the darkness. It was like the trees had swallowed my words and were regurgitating them, distorted and nightmarish. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped my tent. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating pine trunks and shadows and nothing else. I shouted into the forest, demanded to know who was out there, what they wanted. My voice bounced back to me from a dozen different directions, each echo slightly wrong, slightly delayed, the words stretching and compressing like they were being pulled through something thick and wet. That's when I heard the footsteps, heavy, deliberate, circling my camp. I spun in place, flashlight sweeping the trees, but I saw nothing. The footsteps continued, crunching through dead leaves and snapping twigs, maintaining a steady distance of maybe 30 yards. Always just beyond the reach of my light. Always moving. I backed toward my tent, keeping the flashlight moving, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. Then everything stopped. Complete silence. No footsteps, no whispers, no wind. The kind of suffocating quiet that makes your ears ring. I stood there, flashlight shaking in my hand, waiting, listening. The fear was physical now, a weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. Help me, my voice again, but desperate, terrified, coming from directly behind me. I whipped around. Nothing there, just trees and darkness. Help me please. Closer now, right at the edge of my camp. I could hear the fear in it, the genuine panic. It sounded exactly like I would sound if I were dying, if I were being torn apart, if I were experiencing unspeakable horror. I ran. I don't remember making the decision. My body just moved. I grabbed my main recording device, left everything else, and I ran through the forest in the dark, my flashlight jerking wildly, branches whipping my face, roots trying to trip me. Behind me, I could hear it, my voice, screaming, begging, sobbing, multiple versions of my voice crying out in agony from every direction, overlapping and echoing until it became a chorus of my own suffering chasing me through the trees. I don't know how long I ran. Time became meaningless. I just focused on not falling, on keeping the flashlight pointed forward, on putting distance between myself and whatever was using my voice. Eventually, impossibly, I found the trail. I followed it in a stumbling sprint until I reached my truck as the sun was rising. I drove straight to the university. I handed over my recording device. I told them what happened. They analyzed the audio files. What they found disturbed them deeply. The recordings contained my voice speaking words I never said, in conversations I never had, describing things I never seen. And underneath it all, barely audible, there was something else. A low-frequency sound, almost below the threshold of human hearing. Rhythmic, purposeful. When they isolated and amplified it, it sounded like breathing. Dozens of sources, all synchronized, all surrounding my campsite. The research team sent another group into the forest a month later. They found my equipment, my tent, everything exactly where I left it. But the recordings on the microphones I abandoned showed something that still makes my blood run cold. For 3 days after I fled, those microphones continued recording, and every single night, they picked up my voice. Talking, laughing, crying, having full conversations with myself, saying things I never said, living through experiences I never had. The university sealed the recordings. They won. They tell me what else was on them. They just strongly suggested I never return to that part of Pennsylvania. I haven I won. But sometimes, late at night when I'm alone, I hear it. Faint and distant, my own voice calling to me from somewhere I can see. And I know with terrible certainty that whatever is in those trees, it kept a piece of me. It learned my voice perfectly. And somewhere in the Allegheny forest, in the deepest and darkest parts where no one ever goes, something is still speaking with my mouth. Still using my words, still being me in ways I never was. I quit my job. I don't do record nature sounds anymore. I can... Because now when I listen to the forest, all I hear is the horrifying possibility that the sounds coming back aren't echoes at all. They re-answers, and whatever is answering has been listening to us for a very long time. If these forest stories feel unsettling, make sure you're subscribed to Vesper Shroud. We focus on true horror stories tied to real locations, and what comes next is even harder to explain. Story 3. Cabin with no tracks. Have you ever wondered what it feels like to find something that should not exist? I am about to tell you about the scariest, most terrifying experience of my life. And I need you to understand that every word of this is true. My name is David, and I was a forest ranger in the Allegheny Mountains of Pennsylvania. I worked alone most days, patrolling vast stretches of dense woodland that few people ever ventured into. For 15 years, I thought I understood the forest. I thought I knew its dangers, its rhythms, its secrets. I was horrifyingly wrong. This happened in February, during one of the heaviest snowstorms that winter. The eerie silence of fresh snow creates a particular kind of quiet that haunts you. Nothing moves, nothing breathes, just white, endless white, and the creaking of frozen branches. That specific day, I was conducting a routine patrol on the eastern ridge when something unsettling caught my eye. Through the thick trees, barely visible through the blowing snow, I saw smoke rising from somewhere deep in the forest. Not a distant fire or a controlled burn. Fresh smoke, actual smoke coming from a chimney. My heart immediately tightened. There should be nothing out there. No camps, no cabins, no people. I knew these mountains like I knew my own house. I had memorized every trail, every ridge, every creek bed for miles. I made my way toward the smoke, moving carefully through the chilling darkness between the towering pines. The temperature had dropped well below freezing, and the wind carried a disturbing, almost metallic taste. After about 20 minutes of hiking, the trees opened up into a small clearing I had never seen before. And there it was, a cabin. The structure was old, weathered, and made from dark logs that looked almost black against the white snow. The roof was heavily laden with ice. Smoke curled from a crooked chimney, and a yellow light glowed in a single window. My first thought was that this was a lost hunter, someone stranded in the storm. I should help them. That was my job, my responsibility. But then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The terrifying, chilling detail that made me understand something was fundamentally wrong. There were no footprints. The snow surrounding the cabin was completely untouched. Not a single track led to the door. Not a single mark in any direction. Just pristine, eerie white snow covering everything. The door itself was visible from where I stood, and the ground immediately in front of it looked exactly like the ground 50 yards away. Undisturbed. Haunting. Impossible. Someone was inside. I could see the light. I could see the smoke. But there was no way for anyone to have gotten there. I stood frozen, my breath coming in clouds of white vapor. The forest around me seemed to hold its breath too. The wind had died to an unsettling, creeping silence. Behind me, the trees were just dark shapes, barely visible through the falling snow. Ahead, the cabin waited, its window glowing like an eye watching me. Logic told me there had to be an explanation. A back door, a tunnel, something. But my instincts, the deeper part of my brain that understands danger, was screaming at me to leave. To turn around and walk away from whatever this was, to pretend I had never seen this place. I stepped forward anyway. My boots crunched loudly on the frozen crust, the sound unnaturally loud in the eerie quiet. With each step, I felt like I was making a terrible mistake. The closer I got to the cabin, the colder I felt. Not the physical cold of February air, but something else. A psychological cold. A creeping, disturbing sensation that my presence was unwelcome. That I was intruding on something that should remain hidden. When I reached the area immediately around the cabin, I examined the snow more carefully. It was undeniable. The snow that had accumulated during the snowstorm was completely smooth around the entire structure. No one had entered. No one had exited. Yet the fire inside was warm. Smoke was actively rising from the chimney. Someone, or something, was definitely in there. I moved to the window and peered inside. The glass was ice-covered and filmy, and the light inside was dim and unsettling. I could make out a shape near what appeared to be a fireplace. A human shape, sitting, waiting, motionless. The horror of the situation began to sink in. This was not right. This violated every rule of reality I understood. I knocked on the wall, and the sound echoed unnaturally loud. My voice came out hoarse and weak when I called out. No response. Nothing but silence and that terrible, creeping feeling that I was being observed. I tried the door. It was unlocked. The handle turned smoothly, and the door swung inward on hinges that made a low, haunting creak. Warmth poured out from inside, thick and almost suffocating. The fire was indeed burning, casting dancing shadows on the walls. And in a chair facing the fire, motionless and silent, sat a figure. It was a man, or had been. He was wrapped in a heavy wool blanket, his head tilted back slightly. His face was gray and slack. His eyes were open, staring at nothing. He was dead. How long he had been dead, I could not tell. Days? Weeks? The warmth of the cabin had preserved him in some unsettling state between fresh death and advanced decay. But here's the truly terrifying part. Here's what made my skin crawl and turned my blood to ice. The man was barefoot. His feet, visible beneath the blanket, were pale and covered in dust. The fireplace behind him was the only heat source in the cabin. There was no electricity, no heater, nothing else that could create warmth. And yet the fire had been burning. The door had been closed. The snow was undisturbed. I staggered backward out of the cabin, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. The cold air hit my face like a shock. I looked again at the snow. Nothing. No tracks. No explanation. The dead man inside the cabin had somehow been in that chair without ever walking there. Without the passage of time following the rules I understood. I ran. I should not have, but I did. I crashed through the underbrush, branches scratching my face, drawing blood that felt hot against my cold skin. I did not stop until I was back on the main trail. My radio was in my jacket pocket, and my hands were shaking so badly that I could barely use it. I reported what I had found. I gave the coordinates as best I could remember them. The response from dispatch was immediate. They told me to wait, to stay on the main trail. Do not go back. Do not investigate further. Within 2 hours, state police and detectives arrived with equipment and dogs. We hiked back toward the cabin, and as we grew closer, I began to feel that same creeping, unsettling dread returning. When we reached the clearing, I stopped. My colleagues continued ahead. They moved through the trees and emerged into the snow-covered space. They looked around, confused. One of them turned back to me and called out. I could not hear the exact words, but the tone was unmistakable. They were searching, looking at the snow, looking around. It took them only a few minutes to find it. A cabin, but not the one I had seen. This cabin was different. The roof was more intact. The wood was lighter in color, and on the ground around it, there were tracks. Fresh tracks, boot prints leading from the tree line to the door. Multiple sets, human footprints. I stood at the edge of the clearing, watching. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. This was not the cabin I had found. It could not be, and yet the detectives were examining it. They were opening the door. They were going inside. Minutes later, they emerged with grim, pale faces. They had found a body inside. A man, recently deceased, they said, probably dead for a day or two. His name was eventually identified as Thomas Mitchell, a man who had disappeared from a small town in the valley 6 months earlier. He had walked into the forest one morning and never came back. Everyone assumed he was dead, lost in the vast wilderness. But he had been found in a cabin that definitely existed, a cabin with tracks leading to and from it, a cabin that was warm but contained a man who had been dead for at least a day, maybe 2. The cabin I had discovered was never found. I tried to lead them back to it, to show them the exact clearing, but the forest seemed different. Twisted. The paths did not lead where I remembered them leading. We found no trace of that dark, impossible structure. No evidence that it had ever existed. In the official report, they suggested that I had become confused in the snow. That I had seen the actual cabin, the one they found, and my mind had played tricks on me. Stress, they said. Exhaustion. The mind creates things when it is afraid. This is what I was told. This is what the report stated. I left my job 3 weeks later. I could not go back into those forests. Every time I thought about it, every time I remembered those dark logs and that impossible snow without footprints, I felt that creeping, unsettling sensation return. That feeling that something was wrong with reality, that there are places in this world where the rules do not apply the way we think they do. I have never told anyone the complete truth. Not my family, not the investigators, not a therapist, though I went to several. How could I? What would I say? I found a haunted cabin that does not appear on any map, containing a man who had been dead for an impossible amount of time, surrounded by snow that showed no human passage. How would that sound to anyone? But I remember it every single night. I remember the yellow light in that window. I remember the face of the dead man, his eyes open and staring. I remember the feeling that I was intruding on something that existed outside normal space and time. Something eerie and disturbing that the forest wanted to keep hidden. The terrifying part is this. Every year, I read about new people who disappear in those Pennsylvania mountains. Hikers who go out and never come back. Hunters who vanish without explanation. Search and rescue teams find nothing. Or sometimes, months later, they find a body in a cabin that was supposedly checked and cleared. I have come to believe that the cabin is still there. That it moves. That it appears when certain conditions are met. The heavy snow, the deepening darkness, the precise moment when someone is vulnerable and alone. And I believe that the man I saw inside, the one with the pale feet and the dead stare, was not the first person to end up there. I believe I was meant to find that cabin. That something in the forest wanted me to see what happens to people who go too deep into the woods, who venture too far from the known paths, who push their luck too much. And here's the most horrifying part of all. The part that keeps me awake at night, the nightmare that returns whenever I close my eyes. When I left my job, I thought I was safe. I thought I had escaped. But occasionally, on dark winter nights, I dream of that cabin. I dream of the dead man in the chair. And when I wake, I find myself standing at my window, looking out at the bare trees in my yard, feeling that same creeping, unsettling sensation. I have never gone back to those mountains. But sometimes I wonder if the forest is waiting, if the cabin is waiting, if something in that eerie, chilling wilderness is simply biding its time, knowing that eventually, curiosity or fate will draw me back. And the most terrifying realization of all is this. I am not entirely sure that my cabin was the impossible one. What if the cabin the police found, the one with the tracks and the explanation, was the haunted one all along? What if my mind, trying to protect itself, created a false memory of something different, something more clearly impossible, to hide the true horror of what I had seen? I do not know anymore, but I know this. There is a cabin in the Pennsylvania forests. It contains dead people who should not be there. And it appears to those who need to find it, for reasons we cannot understand. Do not go looking for it. Do not venture too deep into those mountains when the snow falls and the darkness grows. And if you ever find yourself in a clearing in the forest, with snow all around and a cabin with smoke rising from the chimney, and you notice something disturbing about the silence, about the way the trees seem too still, about the way your breath catches in your throat, then turn around immediately. Walk away. Do not look back. Do not try to understand it. Do not knock on the door, because something in the forest has learned how to wait, and it is very, very good at what it does. Story 4. Lights between the trees. I need to tell you what happened to me. I need someone to know the truth before it happens again, before it happens to you. 3 months ago, I was driving home through the heart of Pennsylvania, this forest at midnight. Just me and the dark highway stretching endlessly in front of my headlights. I was tired. My eyes burned. The radio was playing some forgettable song, and I wasn't thinking about anything except getting to bed. It's when I saw the first light. It wasn't a car. I knew every kind of light that belonged on a highway, and this wasn't one of them. This light was moving slow and deliberate, weaving between the ancient trees like something alive, something conscious. It hovered about 30 feet into the forest, a pale greenish glow that seemed to pulse with intention. My hands tensed on the steering wheel. Something in my chest tightened. That is when the creepy feeling started, that bone-deep awareness that something was horribly wrong. I told myself it was nothing. A hiker with a flashlight. Poachers, maybe. But I knew that wasn't true. No flashlight moved like that. No human light glided through the darkness with such unnatural grace. The eerie sensation grew stronger. My mouth went dry. I pressed the accelerator, and the highway swallowed me forward. Then there was another light, and another 5 separate glows moving through the forest on my left, all weaving between the trees in perfect synchronization. They weren't searching for anything. They were traveling with purpose, moving parallel to my car as if they knew exactly where I was. The terrifying reality of it crashed over me. These lights had intention. These lights were aware of me. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I thought it might burst through my chest. I drove faster. The highway bent and curved, and the lights followed, always staying 30 feet away, always moving with that sickening grace. The shadowy forest pressed in from both sides of the road, an impenetrable darkness that seemed to breathe. Every shadow looked like it might hide something worse than the lights themselves. The unsettling truth was becoming clear. I wasn't just witnessing something strange. I was being hunted. The lights began to multiply. 10 now? 15. 20. They formed a moving constellation, weaving through the trees in patterns that felt almost like language, like communication. My hands shook so violently I could barely keep the car on the road. This was horror on a level 1 you'd never imagine. Not the horror of something jumping out at you. This was the nightmare of being completely helpless, completely aware that something intelligent and other was paying attention to you. The fear was suffocating. I remember screaming. I remember the sound of my own voice, high and desperate, filling the small space of my car. I remember pressing the accelerator all the way to the floor, feeling the engine roar beneath me, watching the speedometer climb past 90, past 100. The lights didn't fall behind. They moved with me, effortlessly keeping pace as if the laws of physics didn't apply to them. The darkest part of my mind whispered a terrible thought. What if they were hurting me? What if I was exactly where they wanted me to be? The highway ahead was empty and endless. Behind me, the lights filled the forest, and I couldn't tell anymore where the shadows ended and they began. Everything was a nightmare blur of darkness and pale, sickening light. The disturbing truth hung over me like a weight. I was alone on that road. No one was coming. No one would help me. There was only me and the lights and whatever intelligence moved them through the Pennsylvania forest. My exit appeared suddenly, materialized out of the darkness like salvation. A small town, lights in the distance, civilization. I wrenched the wheel and flew down the ramp, my tires screaming against the asphalt. The lights didn't follow onto the exit. They stopped at the tree line, hovering there like predators watching prey escape into a den they couldn't enter. I watched them in my rearview mirror, shrinking, diminishing, but not disappearing. I drove straight to the police station. The officers who took my statement looked at me like I was insane. A man with wild eyes and shaking hands, babbling about lights in the forest. They were kind about it, in that practice way cops are when they re-humoring someone. They said they'd send a patrol out to the area. They gave me coffee and let me sit in a warm room while the adrenaline slowly drained from my body. By dawn, I was starting to doubt myself. Fear can do that. It can make you question everything, even what you saw with your own eyes. But 2 days later, I got a call from the police department. They found something on the highway where I'd been driving. A trooper had noticed it during a morning patrol. The asphalt was scorched, not burned by a normal fire. These were irregular patterns, almost geometric, laid out in the forest near the road. The ground was blackened in ways that didn't make sense, in shapes that seemed intentional, arranged by something with purpose. The officers didn't tell me this directly. I heard it from my sister, who talked to someone who worked at the station. But they searched the area. They found the marks. The chilling fact was impossible to ignore. I wasn't crazy. The lights were real. Over the following weeks, I couldn't stop researching. I found message boards, obscure websites, Reddit threads buried deep in the internet. For decades, drivers had been reporting the same thing. Lights moving through Pennsylvania, forests at night, weaving between trees, moving with intelligence and purpose. People called them different names. Some said they were paranormal. Others whispered about classified military experiments, strange aircraft testing in remote areas, things the government didn't want people to know about. But there was more. The scorched ground. It was a pattern that repeated. Drivers would report the lights, and later, patches of earth would be found burned in those same irregular, geometric patterns. Scientists couldn't explain the burns. They weren't consistent with any known fire. The earth was scorched from below sometimes, as if something had been pressed against the ground with intense heat. The scorching appeared and disappeared. Sometimes it would be there 1 week and gone the next, as if it was being erased. The terrifying implication was that something was actively hiding its traces. I stopped driving at night. I quit my job and found work that kept me home or driving during daylight hours. My friends thought I was having a breakdown. My family staged an intervention. They didn't understand. They hadn't seen the lights. They hadn't felt that presence. That chilling awareness that you were being observed by something that didn't belong in any universe that made sense. But I couldn't escape it. The fear had rooted itself in me, deep and permanent. 6 weeks after my encounter, I was driving home at dusk, Still daylight but fading fast, when I saw a car pulled over on the shoulder of the same stretch of road. A man stood outside, looking into the forest. His posture was wrong. His arms hung at odd angles. Something about the way he stood made my skin crawl. He stopped. I drove past him and watched him in my mirror, watching the forest with that same unsettling intensity. 20 miles later, I couldn't help myself. I called the police and reported a suspicious person. They said they'd check it out. I never heard what they found. The thing nobody wants to admit is that it never really ends. The fear doesn't fade. It settles into the quiet corners of your mind and waits. Every time you drive through a forest at night, you remember. Every time you see a strange light in the distance, your heart accelerates. You always wonder if they are still out there, if they are still moving between the trees, intelligent and patient, waiting for the right moment, the right driver, the right isolated stretch of road. I am telling you this because I saw something on the news last week. A missing person report. A woman, 32 years old, last seen driving on Route 220 through the heart of Pennsylvania's oldest forests. She called her sister at midnight. Said she was seeing strange lights in the trees. The sister told her to pull over, to call the police. The woman said she couldn't pull over. She said they were surrounding the car. The line went dead. They found her car 3 days later, empty and abandoned at a rest stop. No signs of struggle. No body. Just the car, doors unlocked, keys still in the ignition. Encircling the car in the dirt of the rest stop parking area, irregular patterns of scorched earth, black and burned in shapes that made no geometric sense, as if something had pressed itself against the ground over and over again. The police called it an active investigation. The media called it a tragedy. But I know what it was. I know what happened to her. She'd seen the lights, and the lights had seen her. And whatever moves through those Pennsylvania forests at night had decided she was the one. I am leaving tomorrow. I've sold my house. I am moving to Arizona, somewhere dry and open where there are no ancient forests, nowhere for lights to move unseen between trees, nowhere for things to hide. But I know that one to be enough. The fear I carry with me is heavier than any place I can run to. Sometimes, late at night when I can sleep, I think about the scorched earth. I think about those geometric patterns, and I wonder what they mean. Are they marks left behind? Messages? Or are they something else entirely? Are they the ground itself being burned away where those lights touch down? Where whatever moves through the darkness makes contact with our world? And here is what keeps me awake with the most terrifying certainty. There are thousands of miles of forest in Pennsylvania, thousands of miles of dark highway cutting through it, and every single night, thousands of drivers travel those roads, most of them alone, most of them tired, and all of them are potential witnesses to something that shouldn't exist, something that intelligence agencies and police forces refuse to fully acknowledge. Every night, the lights are still moving between those ancient trees, still weaving through the darkness with impossible grace, still searching, and every driver who crosses that path and sees them becomes like me, becomes someone cursed with knowledge of a horror that lurks in the spaces most people never think about. The disturbing reality is that it is still happening. It is happening right now, somewhere on a Pennsylvania highway. In the darkness between the trees, someone out there is seeing the lights for the first time. Someone out there is experiencing that moment when they realize they are not alone on the road, that something conscious and other is aware of them, moving through the forest with purpose and intelligence. And I wonder if they drive to safety like I did, or if they be one of the ones who doesn't, to make it to the next town, one of the ones whose car is found abandoned, surrounded by scorched earth that makes no human sense. The lights are still out there, and if you driving through Pennsylvania's forests at night, you should know something. If you see them moving between the trees, matching your speed, weaving with that awful intelligence, dawn to try to outrun them, dawn to try to reach the next town, just pull over right there on the side of the road and turn off your headlights. Because I've figured out what the scorched patterns mean. I've studied enough of them now. They were not random. They were not communication. They were selection marks. Spots that have been approved. Places where whatever moves through that darkness has decided the ground is suitable. Suitable for what? I don't know. But I'm not going to stick around Pennsylvania long enough to find out. Story 5. Screaming after midnight. I still hear them. Every night at exactly 12:43, even though I moved 3 states away. The screaming follows you once you've heard it. That's what they done to tell you about the forests in rural Pennsylvania. I was a long-haul trucker for 18 years before last October. I'd driven every highway, every forgotten back road across America. I wasn't scared of the dark. I wasn't scared of being alone. But there are things in those Pennsylvania woods that changed everything I thought I knew about fear. It started when my rig broke down outside a town called Millbrook, population maybe 400. The kind of place where the gas station closes at 6 and everyone knows everyone. My engine died on Route 44, right where the forest gets so thick the trees form a tunnel over the asphalt. It was October 15th. I remember because it was my daughter's birthday, and I was supposed to call her. The nearest motel was 3 miles back. I grabbed my flashlight and started walking. The woods pressed in on both sides, dense and ancient. Pennsylvania forests aren't like the ones out west. These trees have been here since before America had a name. They've seen things. They kept secrets. I reached the Pinecrest Motor Lodge around 9 p.m. The place looked like it hadn't been updated since the 70s. Peeling paint, flickering neon sign, 6 rooms in a horseshoe layout. The clerk was a woman in her 60s with tired eyes that seemed to measure me carefully. Just tonight, I told her. She slid me a key to room 4. You hear anything unusual, you stay inside. Lock your door. I should have asked what she meant. I should have gotten back on the highway the second my truck was fixed. Instead, I nodded like she had just given me normal check-in instructions and headed to my room. The room smelled like old carpet and pine. I tried calling my daughter, but there was no cell signal. The television got 2 channels of static. I ate a cold sandwich from my cooler and waited for sleep. At 12:43 a.m., the screaming started. It wasn't human. It couldn't be human. The sound ripped through the darkness like something dying in agony, echoing from deep in the forest. High-pitched, desperate, horrifying. It lasted maybe 15 seconds, then stopped as suddenly as it began. I was at the window instantly, looking out at the tree line 50 yards away. Nothing moved. The forest stood perfectly still, like it was holding its breath. My hands were shaking. That scream had triggered something primal in my brain. Some ancient recognition of danger that made every nerve-ending fire at once. I heard a door open. The clerk stood outside the office in her bathrobe, looking toward the woods. She saw me at my window and shook her head slowly. A warning. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the chair by the door, listening to the eerie silence that followed the screaming. The kind of quiet that feels wrong, like nature itself has been scared into submission. Morning came slowly. I checked out at dawn, desperate to get back to my truck and get the hell out of Pennsylvania. But the clerk stopped me. You heard it, she said. Not a question. What was that? She glanced around the empty parking lot, then leaned closer. Been happening for 7 months now. Every single night, exactly 12:43. Police came, state police, even brought some kind of search team with thermal cameras and dogs. They found nothing, but the cameras picked up heat signatures. Brief flashes of something warm-blooded out there. Then they just vanish. Like an animal running away? No, her voice dropped to barely a whisper. Like they blinked out of existence. They're 1 second, gone the next. The dogs wouldn't even enter the woods. They stop at the tree line and whine. The way she said it made my skin crawl. This wasn't small-town superstition. This was genuine fear from someone who lived here her whole life. What do people think it is? She straightened up, suddenly formal. Best you get your truck fixed and move on. That's what everyone does. Nobody stays in Millbrook anymore if they can help it. The mechanic in town had my rig ready by noon. I paid cash, filled up on diesel, and started to leave. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the emptiness in that town. The houses with for sale signs. The shuttered businesses. The playground with rusted swings and not a single child. I parked at the edge of town and walked back toward the woods in daylight. The forest looked different in the sun. Normal. Just trees and undergrowth and the smell of pine needles and damp earth. I followed a hiking trail about a quarter mile in, telling myself I just needed to see it in the light. That I needed to prove to myself it was nothing. That's when I found the cabin. It sat in a small clearing, maybe 200 yards off the main trail. Old, probably abandoned for decades. The roof had partially collapsed, and vines crawled up the walls. But something about it felt wrong. The clearing around it was too quiet. No birds, no insects, just oppressive, disturbing silence. I approached slowly, every instinct screaming at me to turn around. The door hung open. Inside, I could see a single room with a dirt floor and the remains of furniture. Then I saw the photographs. They were tacked to the walls. Dozens of them, Polaroids and older pictures, all showing the same thing. People standing at the edge of this clearing. Different people, different decades based on their clothing. But they all had the same expression. Blank, empty, like they weren't really there behind their eyes. In every single photograph, there was something else. A shadow among the trees behind them. Not quite a shape. Not quite human. Just darkness that seemed to watch. My phone buzzed. Impossible. There was no signal out here. But the screen showed a text from an unknown number. Leave. Now. I ran. I crashed through the undergrowth back toward the trail, branches tearing at my clothes. Behind me, I heard something moving through the forest. Not footsteps. Something else. A sound like wind through the trees, except there was no wind. I made it back to my truck, started the engine, and drove. I didn't stop until I crossed into New York State 3 hours later. But that night, in a motel outside Buffalo, the screaming came again. Exactly 12:43 a.m. Distant but unmistakable. That same horrifying, inhuman sound. I called the Pinecrest Motor Launch. The clerk answered on the first ring, like she'd been waiting. You went into the woods, she said. How did you know? Because you took something with you. Not in your pocket. Not anything you can see. But something followed you out. That is what happens. That is why people leave Millbrook. Once you hear the screaming up close, once you go looking for answers, it attaches to you. My blood went cold. What is it? Nobody knows. The old-timers say these forests have been here for thousands of years. They say there are things that live in the spaces between the trees, in the darkness under the roots. Things that were here before humans. Things that daunt to like being disturbed. How do I make it stop? Silence. Then you don't. You just learn to live with it. Some people can handle it. They do terrible things to make the fear stop. Others just go numb. A few go back into the woods. They never seen again. She hung up. That was 4 months ago. I quit trucking. I moved to Arizona, as far from Pennsylvania forests as I could get. But every night at 12:43, I hear it, distant, echoing across impossible miles. The screaming that comes from nowhere and everywhere. I've done research, found articles about Millbrook online, buried in local news archives. The screaming started appearing in reports over 100 years ago. Different decades, same time, same location. The town used to be bigger, over 1,000 people. But every few years, more people leave. The population just slowly bleeds away. I found something else too. Those photographs I saw in the cabin. I found copies posted on an obscure forum by someone who explored the same area in the 90s. Except in their photographs, there were more pictures on the cabin walls. And the shadows in the background were closer, clearer, almost taking shape. Last week, I received a package. No return address. Inside was a single Polaroid photograph. It showed me, standing at the edge of that clearing, taken from inside the tree line. My expression was blank, empty, like all the others. And behind me, barely visible among the pines, something watched. Something with a shape that hurt to look at directly. Something that had always been there, in those ancient Pennsylvania woods, waiting. Tonight is October 15th again. My daughter's birthday. I should call her, but it is 12:42, and I am sitting in the dark, waiting. Because the screaming is about to start, and this time, I think it is getting closer. The last thing the clerk told me keeps replaying in my mind. The ones who go back into the woods are never seen again. But sometimes, late at night, you can hear them join the screaming. 1 minute now, the darkness outside my window seems thicker than it should be. Arizona doesn't have forests like Pennsylvania, but I swear I can smell pine needles. And somewhere in the distance, I hear wind moving through trees that aren't there. 30 seconds. I understand now why people leave Millbrook. Why they abandon their homes and businesses and just run. Because once you've heard what lives in those woods, once you've felt it watching you, you can never truly escape. The fear becomes part of you. It follows you across state lines, across years. 15 seconds. My hands are shaking as I write this. I need someone to know what happened. To understand why, if I disappear, you shouldn't go looking. Especially not in the forests of rural Pennsylvania. Especially not near Millbrook. 5 seconds. The screaming is about to start. But this time, I think I'm going to scream with it. because I finally understand what that sound is. It's not something in the woods. It's everyone who went looking. Story 6. Missing campsite. I found the tent on a Tuesday morning, and I knew immediately that something terrifying had happened there. Listen, I need to tell you this before I lose my nerve. What I discovered in those Pennsylvania woods shouldn't be possible. People don't to just vanish without a trace. They don't to leave behind perfectly intact campsites with everything arranged like some kind of chilling, eerie message. But that's exactly what I found. And I'm still not sure I should have touched anything there. My name is Marcus, and I work as a park ranger for the State Forestry Service. I've been doing this job for 12 years. I know these forests better than I know my own neighborhood. They responded to lost hikers, bear encounters, medical emergencies deep in the wilderness. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for that Tuesday morning in late September when I discovered the missing campsite. The day started normal. I was doing a routine patrol of the backcountry in Pike National Forest, checking on established camping areas to make sure everything was in order. The weather was starting to turn cold. That crisp autumn chill that makes you want to stay home by the fireplace. The forest was beautiful, all those reds and golds and yellows mixing with the dark green of the evergreens. It was peaceful, quiet, the kind of eerie silence you get when the insects start dying off and the birds are preparing to migrate south. I was on my 4th sight of the morning when I noticed something wrong. The fire pit had fresh ash, recent ash. Not from yesterday, but from the night before, maybe earlier that morning. Someone had been here very recently, but there was no one around, no hikers wandering the trails, no tents visible from the main path. I remember feeling a small flutter of something in my chest, a vague unease that I couldn't quite explain. I walked closer to the fire pit, and that is when I saw it. The tent. It was set up maybe 30 feet from the fire pit, tucked into a small clearing surrounded by pine trees. It was a nice tent, expensive looking, the kind that serious campers buy. The door was zipped shut. Everything about it suggested someone was inside, that they just ducked in for a moment and would emerge any second now. I called out a greeting, the standard ranger greeting to alert campers to my presence. No response. I waited a moment and called again, louder this time. Still nothing, just the sound of wind through the trees, this creepy rustling that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. That was when I noticed the supplies. There was a camping stove set up just outside the tent, with a cooking pot sitting on top of it. Next to that was a cooler, the lid closed but presumably full of food. There was a backpack leaning against a tree, packed and ready, like someone had organized everything and then just stopped. Everything was arranged meticulously, almost obsessively neat. The kind of arrangement that speaks to someone who is very careful, very deliberate, very afraid of chaos. I approached the tent slowly, calling out again. I didn't want to startle anyone inside. Campers can get nervous when rangers show up unexpectedly. But my unease was growing now, that creepy sensation you get when something fundamental is wrong with a situation, but you can't quite put your finger on what it is. The tent door was zipped shut from the inside. I knocked on the tent fabric, a light tap that wouldn't be aggressive. Still no response. I could feel my heart rate climbing. This wasn't right. Everything about this situation was sending off alarm bells in my mind. I unzipped the tent with careful, deliberate movements. The tent was empty. I mean, completely empty. There was no sleeping bag, no backpack, no personal gear at all. Just the bare tent floor and that unsettling, eerie emptiness that made my skin crawl. The terrifying realization started to creep into my mind that something very wrong had happened here. Something disturbing and unexplainable. I backed out of the tent slowly, my mind racing. Where was the person who had set up this campsite? Where were the people? Because clearly multiple people had been here based on the amount of supplies and gear. And why had they left everything behind? That is when I saw them. The phones were arranged in a perfect line on a flat rock near the fire pit. 5 phones, all placed side by side, all dark and inactive. They were positioned with such care, such precision, that it was clearly intentional. This wasn't something that had happened by accident. This was a message. This was someone saying something terrifying without using a single word. I picked up the first phone with trembling hands. The screen was cracked badly, spiderweb patterns of damage spreading across the display. I pressed the power button. Nothing. The phone was completely dead, drained of all battery power. I checked the other phones. Same story. All of them were destroyed in some way, and all of them were completely dead. Whatever had happened here, it had happened in such a way that communication was impossible. I pulled out my own phone and called it in. Dispatch answered quickly, and I reported what I found. Abandoned campsite, multiple phones, no sign of the campers. The dispatcher's voice changed immediately, becoming more focused, more serious. She told me to secure the area and not touch anything else. She was sending backup and would contact the state police. While I waited for the backup to arrive, I looked around more carefully, trying to piece together what had happened. There were tracks in the soft ground around the fire pit. Multiple footprints, all of them leading away from the campsite into the dense forest. The tracks didn't suggest panic or running. They looked deliberate, purposeful, like the people had simply walked away into the woods. But they didn't come back. The state police arrived within the hour, along with a search and rescue team. They were professional and thorough, documenting everything, photographing the scene, collecting the abandoned phones as evidence. One of the troopers, a woman named Detective Chen, started asking me questions. When had I last patrolled this area? Had anyone reported the campsite as booked? What were the procedures for backcountry camping permits? I answered everything as best I could, but the truth was I didn't know much. This camping area was remote, rarely used. Permits were handled at the ranger station, not by me directly. I was just doing my routine patrols. Detective Chen ordered a more thorough search of the surrounding forest. She assembled a team and they began walking the perimeter, calling out, looking for any sign of the missing campers. I went with them, my sense of dread growing with every passing minute. There was something about this that felt wrong on a deeper level. The careful arrangement of those phones, the way everything had been left intact but absolutely abandoned, the deliberate footprints leading into the darkness of the forest. It felt like a horror scenario. It felt like something terrifying had happened, something that normal logic couldn't explain. The search yielded nothing. No bodies, no signs of violence, no indication of what had happened to the missing campers. It was as if they had simply walked into the forest and ceased to exist. By that evening, Detective Chen had the information she needed. The campsite had been booked by a family named the Hendersons. Robert Henderson, his wife Sarah, and their 3 teenage children. They had reserved the site for 5 nights starting on Friday. Today was Tuesday. That meant they had been missing for at least 5 days, though based on the fresh fire and the state of the supplies, they had been here more recently than that. The police immediately launched a full missing persons investigation. Search and rescue expanded their efforts, bringing in dogs, helicopters with thermal imaging, organized ground teams. The story made it into the local news. Missing family in Pennsylvania. This forests. Mysterious abandoned campsite. No explanation. Pure horror playing out in real time, but the search turned up nothing. Not a single trace of the Henderson family. I was called in to give a detailed statement, and it's when things started to get really disturbing. The detective showed me photos of the abandoned phones. She told me that the phones had been examined by a tech specialist. All 5 phones belonged to members of the Henderson family. But here is the part that made my blood run cold. The phones had been placed on that rock before they were damaged. The cracks in the screens in the destroyed circuits suggested they had been deliberately destroyed, smashed and broken while they were sitting on that rock. It wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. It was intentional, and there was something else. The last location data on all 5 phones showed them pinging from the campsite area on Saturday night. That was the last signal anyone had received from them. After that, nothing. Complete silence. Complete disappearance. I began to obsess over the details. What had happened on Saturday night? What had caused an entire family to abandon their phones in such a methodical way? What had driven them to walk into the forest and never come back? I started doing my own research, accessing old files from the ranger station. I wanted to know if there had been other incidents in that area, other disappearances, other creepy or terrifying events that might shed light on what happened to the Hendersons. What I found was horrifying. There was a record from 1987 of another abandoned campsite in nearly the same location. A group of college students had been camping, and when rangers went to check on them, they found the tents still standing. Food left out as if they just stepped away for a moment. But the students were gone. They were never found. The case was closed as a cold case, labeled as people who chose to disappear voluntarily. But reading the ranger notes from that time, I could feel the unease in the words. No one believed that explanation. Then there was another incident in 1994. A couple on their honeymoon. Same location. Abandoned campsite. No explanation. The woman was found 3 weeks later, miles away, wandering the forest in a confused state. She was traumatized, terrified, and completely unable to explain where she had been or what had happened to her husband. She was hospitalized for severe psychological trauma and eventually died by suicide 6 months later. Her husband was never found. I started looking further back. There were reports going back decades. Disappearances, abandoned campsites, incomplete investigations, creepy, unsettling incidents that defied explanation. And then I found something truly terrifying. In the old files, there was a handwritten note from a ranger named William Hayes, dated 1978. He had written about a theory, a disturbing hypothesis that he developed after investigating multiple disappearances in the same area. He wrote about the concept of missing time, about how some people reported being lost for hours, but their watches showed only minutes had passed. He wrote about hearing sounds in the forest that didn't match any known animal or phenomenon. He wrote about shadows that moved with intention, that seemed to be watching. And then, at the end of the note, he wrote something that made my hands shake. I believe something is calling them. Something in the darkness between the trees, something that lures people away from safety and doesn't to let them come back. That was the last entry in the file for William Hayes. He had disappeared in 1979. His car was found parked at a remote trailhead, but he was never found. I became obsessed. I couldn't stop thinking about the Henderson family, about the carefully arranged phones, about the deliberate footprints leading into the forest. I couldn't stop thinking about the pattern of disappearances stretching back decades. And I couldn't stop thinking about Ranger Hayes' note, about his theory that something in that forest was actively hunting people. I decided to do something reckless. I decided to camp at that same site, the one where the Hendersons had disappeared. I wanted to see if I could figure out what had happened. I wanted to understand what was out there in that darkness. I set up my tent late on a Friday afternoon, in the exact same spot where the Henderson family had camped. I brought supplies, a radio, a flashlight, a rifle. I told no one where I was going. This was against every rule and regulation in the Ranger Handbook, but I had to know. As darkness fell, the forest changed. The temperature dropped so suddenly that I could see my breath. The wind picked up, moving through the trees with a sound that was almost musical, but wrong somehow. It didn't sound like wind through leaves and branches. It sounded like something else, something that was almost trying to communicate. I sat by my fire, and I listened. Around midnight, I heard the first sound. It was distant, coming from deep in the forest. It sounded like a voice, but not quite human. It was too low, too resonant, like something speaking from deep within the earth itself. I couldn't make out any words, but the sound of it filled me with absolute terror. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to leave, to run, to get out of those woods immediately. But I stayed. I forced myself to stay. More sounds came throughout the night. Multiple voices, all of them strange and unsettling, all of them seeming to call from different directions. Sometimes they seemed to come from nearby, so close I could almost feel warm breath on my face. Other times they seemed distant, echoing through the forest like whispers carried on the wind. And then I heard something that made everything click into place. One of the voices sounded like a child, a young girl, his voice calling out words I could almost understand. Words that sounded like they were trying to form my name. And I recognized that voice. I had heard it on a news broadcast. It was Sarah Henderson, the 16-year-old daughter of Robert and Sarah Henderson. She sounded terrified, like she was calling for help, like she was right there in the darkness just beyond my fire pit. I grabbed my flashlight and stood up, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold it. I directed the beam into the forest, but there was nothing there except trees and darkness. The voice stopped calling, the sounds faded, and I was left in a silence that was somehow worse than the noise had been. That is when I understood what had happened to the Henderson family. That is when the horrible truth crystallized in my mind. They hadn't been running from anything. They had been called. Something in that forest had lured them away from their campsite. Something that knew how to mimic human voices, how to exploit the emotions and fears of people in the darkness. Something that hunted in the Pennsylvania forests, using the night and the isolation and the cold to lure campers away from safety. And once they were away from the fire, once they were alone in the darkness, something happened to them. Something that made them disappear, that erased them from existence, that left nothing behind except abandoned campsites and carefully arranged phones that served as a chilling marker of their fate. I abandoned my campsite that night. I didn't bother packing carefully. I just grabbed my essential supplies and walked out of those woods as fast as I could. I didn't stop walking until I reached my truck. And even then I didn't feel safe. I didn't feel safe until I was home, inside my house, with all the lights on. I tried to report what had happened to Detective Chen, but she didn't believe me. She thought I was traumatized from discovering the Henderson campsite, that I had developed a psychological fixation on the case. She suggested I take some time off work, see a therapist, get some perspective. I tried to convince her about the pattern of disappearances, about William Hayes' notes, about what I had heard that night in the forest. But it became clear that she thought I was losing my grip on reality. The last thing she said to me was that if I continued to make these unfounded accusations, I might lose my job. So I stopped talking about it, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. I started looking into the historical records more carefully, cross-referencing disappearances not just in Pike National Forest but in forests all across Pennsylvania. And I found them, dozens of them, sometimes separated by years, sometimes clustered together over a short period. But always in the backcountry, always at remote campsites, always with that same eerie pattern of abandoned gear and absent people. I found references to something called the Campfire Hollow. According to old folklore and oral histories passed down through generations of Pennsylvania families, Campfire Hollow was a place where people went and didn't come back. It was in the old stories, the ones told around fires in the early settling days of Pennsylvania. It was supposed to be a place where the forest itself was alive, where it could think and feel and hunt. I found an account from the 1800s written by a man named Jonathan Pike, supposedly a frontier explorer. He had tried to map out the exact location of Campfire Hollow, but his notes were incoherent, confused, like he was describing something that his mind couldn't quite process. The last entry in his journal read, "The darkness calls to them. The voices in the night are not animals. They are not human. They are something older, something that has always been here, something that is still here, waiting in the spaces between the trees." Jonathan Pike disappeared 6 months after writing that entry. He was never found. I quit my job last month. I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't patrol those forests knowing what was out there. I couldn't maintain the lie that everything was safe and normal in Pennsylvania, this backcountry, when I knew the terrifying truth. The Henderson family is still missing. No remains have ever been found. No explanation has ever been given. The case is cold, but it's not forgotten. Not by me. I think about them every day. I think about that moment when they heard the voices calling from the darkness. I think about that terrible decision they must have made when they stood at the edge of their campfire, this light, and saw something in the shadows that made them abandon everything and walk into the woods. And I think about those phones, arranged so carefully on that rock. They weren't abandoned by accident. They were left there deliberately, a message, a warning. They were left there to say, "We heard it, we saw it, we understood what was happening, and we couldn't stop ourselves. I don't to camp anymore. I don't to hike in remote areas. I don't to go near the backcountry of Pennsylvania, those forests." And I would beg anyone listening to this to do the same. Don't to go camping in those woods. Don't to set up a tent at night in the wilderness. Don't to sit by a campfire in those dark forests. Because something is out there, something old and patient and hungry, something that knows how to call to you, something that wears the voices of people you love and uses them to lure you away from safety and light. And once you answer that call, once you step away from the fire and into the darkness, you belong to the forest. You become part of a chilling pattern. You become another empty campsite, another set of abandoned phones, another mystery that will never be solved. The missing campsite was never just about the Henderson family. It was about all of them. It was about every person who walked into those woods and didn't come back. And it will keep happening, because something in those Pennsylvania forests is still calling, still waiting, still hunting. And somewhere out there, in the darkness between the trees, those voices are still echoing through the night. Calling, always calling. I hope you never hear your name spoken in that voice. I hope you never stand at the edge of a campfire, this light, and see a shadow moving toward you that shouldn't be moving at all. Because if you do, you want to come back. The forest will make sure of that. Story 7. Tree that bled. I found something in the woods outside Pittsburgh that the government doesn't want you to know about. Something so disturbing and horrifying that when I reported it, 3 men in unmarked vehicles showed up at my house within 6 hours. They made me sign papers. They took my photos. They told me to forget what I'd seen. But I can forget. And after what happened to the others who touched it, I need to tell someone before it's too late. My name is Michael Corrigan. I am a land surveyor. They worked in Pennsylvania forests for 23 years, mapping property lines, measuring elevations, marking boundaries for developers and conservation groups. I've seen bear kills, illegal dump sites, and the aftermath of meth lab explosions deep in the woods. Nothing prepared me for what I encountered on October 14th in the Laurel Highlands, 40 miles southeast of Pittsburgh. The job was routine. A wealthy developer from Philadelphia wanted to buy 200 acres of old-growth forest to build luxury cabins. My task was to survey the land, mark the corners, document any features that might affect construction. The property was remote, accessible only by an old logging road that hadn't been maintained in decades. My truck barely made it through. Branches scraped both sides, mud sucked at my tires. When I finally parked and stepped out, the silence hit me like a physical thing. No birds, no insects, just dead air and the smell of rotting leaves. I grabbed my equipment and started walking the property line. The forest was dense with oak and maple, their trunks thick and ancient, their branches forming a canopy so tight that even at noon, the ground remained in shadow. The darkness felt wrong somehow. Too complete, too hungry. I'd been surveying for maybe an hour when I noticed the tree. It stood alone in a small clearing, maybe 60 feet tall, bark black as charcoal. Not the healthy black of wet bark, but the sick black of something burned or diseased. The creepy thing was, every other tree in that forest looked healthy. Green moss, normal bark, but this one looked dead. Except it wasn't dead. Because as I got closer, I saw it was bleeding. Thick red liquid oozed from cracks in the bark, running down the trunk in slow rivulets, pooling at the base. My first thought was sap. Some trees produce red sap when damaged, but this wasn't sap. The color was too deep, too rich. It looked exactly like blood. Dark venous blood, the kind that comes from deep inside a body. I should have walked away. Every instinct told me to turn around and finish my survey on the other side of the property. But curiosity is a terrible thing. I set down my equipment and approached the tree. The smell hit me at 10 feet. Metallic, copper, the unmistakable scent of fresh blood. My stomach turned. I pulled out my phone and took pictures. Close-ups of the red liquid. Wide shots of the whole tree. Evidence of whatever this terrifying thing was. Then I made my first mistake. I touched it. The liquid was warm. Body temperature warm. I pulled my hand back fast, my fingers sticky and red. My heart started hammering. Trees dawn to bleed warm liquid. Trees dawn to smell like hemoglobin. I wiped my hand on my jeans, but the substance clung to my skin, thick and viscous. I took a step back, then another, my mind trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe it was some kind of chemical reaction. Maybe someone had dumped something here. Maybe this was a crime scene and I just contaminated evidence. I heard the sound then. Soft at first, a wet rhythmic pulsing coming from inside the tree. Like a heartbeat, slow and steady. Thump, 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 thump. I pressed my ear against the bark, and the horror of what I heard nearly made me vomit. It was a heartbeat, strong and regular, coming from deep inside the wood. Something was alive in there. Something with a pulse. I ran back to my truck. I didn't finish the survey. I didn't mark the corners. I just drove out of there as fast as the logging road would allow, my hands shaking on the wheel, my shirt soaked with sweat despite the cold October air. When I got cell service, I called the state forestry department. I told them about the tree, about the blood, about the heartbeat. The woman on the phone sounded skeptical, but she took down the location and said someone would check it out. They checked it out all right. The next morning, I woke up to 3 black SUVs parked in front of my house. 6 men in dark suits. They showed me identification from agencies I'd never heard of. They asked me questions for 2 hours. Had I told anyone else? Had I posted the photos online? Who else knew the exact location? I gave them my phone. They deleted everything. Then they made me sign a non-discrimination agreement so thick it took 20 minutes just to initial all the pages. One of them, an older man with gray hair and eyes like ice, leaned in close and spoke in a low, chilling voice. He told me the tree had been removed. He told me the area was now federal property. He told me that what I found was classified, and if I spoke about it to anyone, I face federal charges. Then he said something that still haunts me. He said I was lucky I only touched it. He said the last person who cut into it never came home. I tried to forget. I really did. I took other jobs. I avoided that part of the state. But 3 weeks later, I started having nightmares. Dark, unsettling dreams about trees with eyes and roots that moved like fingers. I'd wake up sweating, my heart racing, the sheets tangled around my legs. And my hand, the one I touched the tree with, started to hurt. A deep aching pain in the bones, like something was growing inside. I went to a doctor. She took x-rays. What she found made her face go pale. There was something in my hand, small dark masses between the metacarpals, organic material that shouldn't be there. She wanted to do a biopsy immediately. But before she could schedule it, 2 of the men in suits showed up at the clinic. They spoke with her privately. When she came back, she wouldn't look me in the eye. She said the x-rays had been a mistake, a glitch in the machine. She said my hand was fine. She said I should go home. But my hand wasn't fine. Over the next few days, the pain got worse. I could feel movement under the skin, tiny shifting sensations, like something tunneling through tissue. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. The fear was overwhelming. I was convinced something from that tree had infected me, something alive and growing. On the 5th night, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen. I sterilized it with a lighter. I made a small incision in my palm, just deep enough to see what was inside. What came out wasn't blood. It was sap, thick red sap, the same substance that had oozed from the tree. And inside the sap, moving slowly, were tiny root fibers. White and thread-like, growing, spreading. I called the emergency number the men had given me. They arrived within 30 minutes. They took me to a facility I am not allowed to name, in a location I am not allowed to reveal. Doctors in hazmat suits examined me. They cut the roots out of my hand. They burned the tissue. They kept me there for 6 days, running tests, asking questions, treating me like a specimen instead of a person. On the last day, the gray-haired man came to see me. He sat down across from me in a sterile white room and told me things I wish I didn't know. He said the tree had been there for over 100 years. He said it wasn't the only one. He said there were others scattered throughout Pennsylvania, these forests, all of them bleeding, all of them alive in ways that defied explanation. He said they didn't know what the trees were or where they came from. They just knew they were dangerous, extremely dangerous. He told me about the others who found the trees over the years. Loggers who cut into them, hikers who carved their initials in the bark, researchers who taken samples. Some disappeared. Some died in ways that couldn't be explained. And some, like me, became infected. He said I was one of the lucky ones. He said they caught it early. He said the roots in my hand had only just started spreading. If I waited another week, they would have reached my heart. They released me with more paperwork and more threats. They told me to live my life and forget what happened. But how do you forget something like that? How do you forget the feeling of roots growing inside your body? How do you forget the sound of a heartbeat coming from inside a tree? I can't survey land anymore. I can't go into forests. The fear is too overwhelming. Every tree looks suspicious now. Every shadow feels threatening. I wake up at night convinced I can feel movement under my skin, even though the doctors swore they removed everything. The nightmares never stop. If anything, they've gotten worse, more vivid, more disturbing. And here is the truly terrifying part, the part that keeps me up at night. The gray-haired man let something slip during one of our conversations. He said the trees were spreading. He said they documented 17 in Pennsylvania in the 1980s. Now there are over 40, and they read not just in Pennsylvania anymore. They've been found in West Virginia, Ohio, New York, always in remote areas, always far from cities, always bleeding. He said they don't know what the trees want. They don't know if they reconscious or just following some alien biological imperative. They don't know if they from Earth or somewhere else. They just know the trees are growing, multiplying, and anyone who gets too close risks infection. I think about the developer who wanted to buy that land. I wonder if he knows what he almost built on. I think about the hikers and campers who wander through Pennsylvania's forests every year, looking for peace and solitude. I wonder how many of them have walked past one of those trees. How many have touched the bark? How many have warm red sap drying on their hands right now, not knowing what is about to grow inside them? The government won. To warn people. They can. How do you tell the public that there are trees that bleed and infect humans without causing mass panic? How do you explain something that shouldn't to exist? So they stay quiet. They remove the trees when they refound. They silence the witnesses. They let people keep hiking and camping and surveying, blissfully unaware of the danger lurking in the shadows. I'm breaking my agreement by telling you this. I'm risking federal charges. Maybe worse, but I can't stay silent anymore. Someone needs to know. If you hike in Pennsylvania, if you camp in the forests, if you work outdoors like I did, be careful. Be aware. If you see a tree with black bark standing alone in a clearing, stay away from it. If you see red liquid oozing from cracks in the wood, don't touch it. Don't get close. Don't let your curiosity override your fear. Because that tree I ascend to dead. It's alive. And it is hungry. And if you touch it, if you let that warm red sap get on your skin, you become part of it. The roots will grow inside you. They spread through your body. And eventually, maybe years from now, maybe decades, you understand what those trees really are. What they rebuilding toward. What they re-preparing for. I still have scars on my palm from where they cut the roots out. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I can feel them growing back. The doctors say it's impossible. They say they removed everything. But I know better. I felt that heartbeat. I smelled that blood. I know those trees are more than just wood and sap. They were waiting, growing, spreading through our forests like a disease. And one day, maybe soon, there will be too many to remove. Too many to hide. And then everyone will know the horrifying truth that I learned in those Pennsylvania woods. Some trees dawn to grow toward the light. Some grow toward us. Story 8. Woods went silent. What if the forest could stop breathing? What if, in the space of a single second, every living thing in an entire ecosystem simply ceased to exist? I know how that sounds. Impossible. Insane. But I experienced it, and I need to tell you what happened before I forget the details. Before my mind tries to protect itself by burying the memory where it belongs. My name is Marcus, and I'm a hunting guide in the forests of western Pennsylvania. Or at least, I was. I cannot do that work anymore. Not after what I discovered in those woods. This happened last November, during the tail end of deer season. The forest was thin and skeletal, with most of the leaves gone. The ground was covered in crispy brown underbrush that crackled when you walked across it. I was leading 2 clients, wealthy men from Pittsburgh who had paid good money to hunt on private land deep in the Allegheny Mountains. We had been hiking since dawn, moving quietly through the eerie silence of late autumn. Around 2 in the afternoon, we stopped to rest on a ridge overlooking a wide valley. The men ate sandwiches while I scanned the forest with binoculars, looking for movement. The day was unseasonably warm, and I remember thinking that the deer would be bedded down in the shade, reluctant to move. We would have a long wait ahead of us. Then something happened that I will never forget. Something that changed my understanding of how the world actually works. The forest went silent. Not gradually, not slowly fading into quiet. Instantly, completely. One moment I could hear the wind moving through the bare branches, the rustling of leaves as small animals moved through the underbrush, the distant calls of crows somewhere deeper in the woods. Normal forest sounds, the soundtrack of a living, breathing wilderness. Then, in an instant I can only describe as abrupt and terrifying, all of it stopped. The wind ceased, the trees stopped moving, the forest sounds vanished completely. I could hear my own heartbeat, my own breathing, the faint sound of one of my clients chewing his sandwich. But from the forest around us, nothing. Not a sound, not a whisper, not the smallest crackle of a twig or the call of a bird. Complete, eerie, unsettling silence. My clients did not seem to notice at first. They kept eating, kept talking in low voices. But I felt it, that creeping sensation you get when you know something is fundamentally wrong. A psychological alarm bell ringing in the deeper parts of my brain. Danger. Something was disturbing. Something was not right. I stood up and walked to the edge of the ridge. The valley stretched out before me, a vast expanse of dark trees and shadows. The silence was so complete it felt like pressure against my ears. I had spent 23 years in these woods. I had never experienced anything like this before. Every instinct I had developed over 2 decades told me this was wrong. This was terrifying. I looked up. That was my mistake. That was the moment when I saw something that I cannot fully explain. something that my mind has tried desperately to repress ever since. In the trees above us, maybe 40 feet up in the branches of a massive oak, something was watching us. I could not see it clearly. That is the horrifying part. Whatever it was, whatever intelligence was focusing on us from those high branches, it existed just outside the range of my clear vision. In my peripheral sight, I caught the shape of something dark and wrong. Something that did not move like an animal. Something that was aware of us in a way that felt conscious. Deliberate. Chilling. The moment I noticed it, the moment my eyes tried to focus directly on the shape, it was gone. But the feeling of being watched remained. Intense. Undeniable. Creeping across my skin like cold fingers. I turned back to my clients. Their faces had changed. They had felt it too. The sudden, eerie silence. The awareness that something in the forest was observing us from above. One of them, a man named Richard, stood up slowly. His hand was trembling slightly. I made a decision in that moment that I would come to regret. I decided we should leave. Not run, because running would be panic. But move, calmly and deliberately, we would make our way back toward the truck. I did not explain the specific reason. I simply told them that the light was wrong, that the hunting conditions had changed, and that we should try another location tomorrow. We gathered our gear and began walking back down the ridge. The silence followed us. This was the terrifying part. The forest did not gradually return to normal. The sounds did not gradually resume. The wind did not slowly pick up again. We walked through an extension of that same complete, eerie silence. No bird calls, no rustling, no sound of life at all. Just the crunch of our feet on the dead leaves and the rasping of our breath. It felt like we were walking through a place that was no longer alive. Like the forest had died around us, and we were moving through its corpse. My clients were frightened. I could tell by the way they walked, the way they held their weapons, the way they constantly looked around at the dark trees pressing in on all sides. The creeping dread was contagious. We had walked into something that did not belong in the normal world. Something that violated the rules of nature. We were about halfway back to the truck when the sounds began again. Not gradually. Just as suddenly as they had stopped, the forest came back to life. The wind rushed through the branches with a sound like a gasp. Birds called out in scattered, unsettled voices. Small animals crashed through the underbrush as if they were panicking, fleeing from something. It was chaos. It was frightening. But it was alive. It was normal, or at least, it was closer to normal than that eerie silence had been. We reached the truck and drove back to the lodge in silence. My clients did not want to talk about what had happened. They pretended they had not noticed anything unusual. But I could see the fear in their eyes. I could see that they had felt it too. That moment when the forest had stopped breathing, when something wrong had stepped into our world. That night, alone in my cabin near the lodge, I tried to rationalize what I had experienced. Maybe it was a phenomenon I was not familiar with. Some kind of environmental anomaly. Pressure change. A rare meteorological event. My mind grasped at explanations like a drowning man grasping at driftwood. But I knew better. Deep down, in the part of my brain that understands danger, I knew that something genuinely horrifying had happened. Something had been watching us. Something that could make an entire forest fall silent. Something that existed in a way that our normal understanding of nature could not accommodate. The next morning, Richard and his friend told me they were leaving early. They did not want to hunt anymore. They did not want to spend another night in those woods. They paid me the remainder of my fee and left. I was relieved to see them go, but I made a terrible mistake. Instead of leaving as well, instead of abandoning the lodge in those mountains, I decided to stay. I decided to go back into the forest. I told myself it was to understand what had happened, to find some rational explanation. But deep down, I know I was driven by something else. Obsession, fear, the need to know. 3 days later, I went back to the same ridge. I told myself I would go during daylight, that I would stay alert and aware, that I could handle whatever was out there. I was a fool. I reached the ridge around noon. The forest was normal that day. Wind in the trees, bird calls, the rustling sounds of the living wilderness. No signs of anything disturbing or eerie. Part of me was relieved. Part of me was disappointed. Part of me was terrified that the silence might return without warning. I sat on a fallen log and waited. I am not sure what I was waiting for. Some kind of sign, some kind of explanation. Hours passed. The afternoon light began to fade. The shadows between the trees grew longer and deeper. The eerie feeling in my chest grew stronger. And then it happened again. The silence returned. This time, I was alone. This time, I could not rationalize it as a shared hallucination or a trick of the mind. This time, it was unmistakably real. The forest simply stopped existing as a place of sound. The wind that had been blowing across my face vanished. The distant calls of crows, which I had been hearing all afternoon, cut off mid-sound. The rustling of the underbrush ceased completely. I stood up slowly. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might have a heart attack. The silence was so complete it created a ringing sound in my ears. My own breath seemed impossibly loud. I waited for something to appear, for whatever had been watching us before to reveal itself, for the terrifying moment when I would finally see what had invaded our world. But nothing happened. The silence continued. Minutes passed, minutes that felt like hours. The shadows deepened. The light between the trees turned a sickly golden color as the sun began to set. The eerie darkness of approaching night settled over the forest like a shroud. And then, something I had not expected happened. I heard a sound. It was not a normal forest sound. It was not wind or animal or any living thing I recognized. It was a sound like something being dragged, something heavy being pulled through the underbrush, something coming toward me. I could not see what was making the sound. The trees blocked my view, but I could hear it growing closer. The dragging sound continued, slow and deliberate and horrifying. Something was moving through the forest toward the ridge where I stood. That was when I ran. I abandoned my rifle and my gear, and I ran. I crashed through the trees, branches whipping at my face and drawing blood. The eerie silence seemed to chase me as I fled. Behind me, the dragging sound continued. Something was following me through the forest. I did not stop running until I could see the lights of the lodge. I burst out of the trees, gasping and trembling. My face was bleeding. My clothes were torn. I looked like a madman. The lodge owner found me on the road and took me inside. I did not tell him what had happened. I could not. How could I explain that I had heard something dragging itself toward me through the silent forest? That I had felt the presence of something watching me from the darkness above? I left the next morning. I have not returned to those mountains since. But here's what terrifies me most. Here's what keeps me awake at night. The lodge owner told me something the next day, something that he mentioned casually as I was packing my bags. He said that other hunters had reported the same thing. That eerie silence, that feeling of being watched from above. He said that it had been happening for years. That hunters in those woods described moments when the forest simply stopped. When all the living sounds ceased at once. Some reported the chilling sensation of something watching them from the high branches. Some said they had heard sounds like dragging in the darkness. The local hunters had a name for it. They called it the silence, and they all avoided it. They avoided certain parts of the forest, certain times of year, certain conditions when they knew the silence was more likely to come. Nobody knew what caused it. Nobody could explain it, but everyone who spent time in those woods knew it was real. And everyone knew that if you were caught in the silence, if you were the one being watched, you needed to leave. You needed to get out before darkness fell completely. Since that experience, I have done research. I have read old accounts from loggers and hunters dating back more than 100 years. The descriptions are consistent. The forest going silent, the feeling of being watched from above, the dragging sounds in the darkness, the eerie terror of something that does not belong in nature observing you with what feels like intention. Some of the old accounts describe people who did not leave, people who were caught in the silence as night fell. They were found days later, sometimes miles from where they were last seen. They were never the same. The ones who survived told stories that made no sense. Stories about losing time, about seeing things in the darkness that human eyes were not meant to perceive. I have come to believe that the forest in those Pennsylvania mountains is not entirely part of our world. That there are places and times when something else can reach through, when the normal rules of nature are suspended, when something ancient and terrifying can observe us from the spaces between trees. I have also come to believe that whatever it is patient. It does not attack. It does not kill, at least not directly. It simply watches. It creates that eerie silence. It waits for darkness to fall. And if you are foolish enough to remain, if you are trapped by fear or foolish curiosity, it does something to you. Something that changes you in ways that cannot be undone. I dream about that sound. The dragging, the slow, deliberate movement of something heavy through the forest. In my nightmares, I never make it out. In my nightmares, darkness falls while I am still in the woods. In my nightmares, I feel the presence of that thing standing directly behind me, watching, observing, waiting to do whatever it does to those who cannot escape. The most horrifying realization is this: I still feel observed, even now, in my home, far from those woods, On quiet nights when the wind is still and everything is silent, I feel that same creeping sensation. That awareness that something is watching me from just outside my field of vision. That something from those Pennsylvania forests has never stopped watching me. I do not know if it followed me. I do not know if the silence can exist anywhere, or if it is tied to that specific place in the mountains. I do not know what it wants, or why it observes, or what would happen if I ever returned. But I know this: if you are ever in those woods, in western Pennsylvania, and the sound suddenly stops, if the wind ceases and the animals go silent and the entire forest seems to hold its breath, do not wait to understand why. Do not stay to investigate. Do not think that remaining in daylight will keep you safe. Get out. Leave immediately. Run if you have to. Because the darkness there is not just an absence of light. It is something that reaches out from between the trees. It is something that watches. Something that has been watching for longer than recorded history. And once it has focused its attention on you, once you have felt that eerie gaze from the high branches, it never entirely looks away. Story 9. Radio that wouldn't stop. The emergency radio started talking to me on the third night, and I knew right then that something was fundamentally wrong with the universe. That's not the kind of thing you say lightly. That's not the kind of thing a rational person admits out loud. But I'm telling you this because you need to understand what can happen when you venture into Pennsylvania, its oldest forests alone. When you re-isolated from civilization. When you think you re-safe, but something terrifying is watching you from the shadows. I was camping near Tioga County, deep in the wilderness where the cellular signal dies and the forest becomes an endless cathedral of ancient pines. Just me, my tent, a dying campfire, and that emergency radio I brought as backup. The creepy feeling started subtle. Nothing I could point to specifically. It was just the way the darkness seemed to press in from all sides, the way sounds didn't carry right through the dense trees. The eerie silence that felt almost alive, like the forest itself was holding its breath. The radio was a basic model, military grade, something I picked up years ago and never really used. It had sat in my garage for so long I'd nearly forgotten I'd depacked it. I checked the batteries before I left my house. 2 fresh AA is tested and working. The thing powered up with a satisfying click, the small LED blinking green to indicate full battery life. I set it on the log next to me, tuned it to the emergency channel, and figured it was good to have around just in case. That is when the unsettling part began. Around 2 in the morning, I jolted awake to a sound. Not an animal sound, something worse. It was voices coming from the radio sitting 3 feet from my sleeping bag. The chilling quality of those voices struck me immediately. They weren't the normal radio static or the usual emergency broadcast tones. These were human voices, speaking calmly, methodically, reading a list. I remember my hands shaking as I reached for the radio, thinking maybe I accidentally left it on, that maybe I was just confused from sleep. But the battery indicator still showed full power. The channel I tuned it to was dead, nothing but static on that frequency. Yet the voices continued, clear and distinct, coming directly from the speaker. The horrifying realization hit me that I wasn't hearing regular radio. This was something else entirely. The voices were reading names of towns. Tioga, Jersey Shore, McConnellsburg, Woodward. They spoke each name slowly, deliberately, as if marking them for some dark purpose. The terrifying thing was that these were all real towns near my location. The voice paused between each name, and in those pauses, I could hear something underneath the words. A sound like breathing, like whatever was speaking wasn't entirely comfortable with human language. I switched the radio off. My fingers fumbled with the power button, and it took me 3 tries to get it to actually shut down. The LED went dark. The voices stopped. I sat there in my tent with my heart pounding so hard I thought I might have a medical emergency. The darkness outside seemed to press against the thin fabric walls of my tent. The nightmare sensation of being watched, of being the subject of some vast and incomprehensible attention, settled over me like a suffocating blanket. I told myself I imagined it. Sleep deprivation makes people hear things. Isolation does strange things to your mind. I lay back down, my sleeping bag suddenly feeling like it offered no protection at all. The fearful darkness seemed to penetrate every layer of fabric. I kept one hand on the radio the entire rest of the night, ready to grab it if the voices came back, knowing full well that having the power off wouldn't stop them if they wanted to speak again. When daylight came, the world seemed normal. Sunlight filtered through the trees in golden shafts. Birds sang. The forest looked peaceful, almost welcoming. I told myself I had a nightmare, that the events of the previous night had been some strange dream brought on by the stress of being alone in the wilderness. I packed up my camp, ate some cold food, and tried to act like nothing was wrong. But the disturbing certainty that something had happened, something real, kept gnawing at me. By that evening, as darkness fell again and I set up a new camp about 5 miles deeper into the forest, I knew I was making a mistake. Rational people would have left. Reasonable people would have packed everything up and driven back to civilization. But I was frozen by a horrible fascination. That same impulse that makes people slow down at car accidents. That makes them open doors they know they shouldn't to open. I had to understand what was happening. I had to know if last night had been real. I turned the radio on again. This time, it came to life faster. The voices started almost immediately, and there were more of them now. Multiple voices speaking in unison, a horrifying chorus reading the same list of towns. Tioga, Jersey Shore, McConnellsburg, Woodward, then more names. Duncannon, Marysville, Lewistown. The eerie quality of their perfect synchronization made my skin crawl. These weren't regional broadcasts or some weird weather emergency. This was something deliberately communicating with me, using the radio as a conduit. The terrifying part was that the radio had been completely powered down. I removed the batteries before setting up this new camp, triple-checked that they were out. I left the radio sitting on a rock for over an hour while I gathered firewood and set up my tent. When I picked it up to retrieve it, I put new batteries back in, fresh ones from my supply pack. And the moment those batteries made contact with the terminals, the voices had come roaring back to life, as if they'd been waiting for me to turn it back on. The names continued. The litany grew longer. The voices sounded wrong in ways I couldn't quite articulate. Sometimes they spoke in perfect unison, and sometimes they seemed to argue with each other, one voice speaking over another in a disturbing overlap of language. The creepy sensation that I was listening to something that existed just outside my understanding. Something that was trying to communicate but didn't quite comprehend how human speech worked, grew stronger with every moment. I threw the radio into the darkness. I heard it hit something hard, heard the sound of breaking plastic, heard the batteries tumble out and scatter across the forest floor. The voices cut off instantly, leaving only silence. The chilling quiet that followed was somehow worse than the voices had been. I sat by my campfire with my sleeping bag wrapped around my shoulders, staring into the darkness, waiting for something to happen. The screaming started an hour later. I couldn't tell where it was coming from. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing through the forest from multiple directions. High-pitched, agonized, definitely human, but stretched and distorted in ways that shouldn't be possible. The horrifying sound went on for nearly 3 minutes before cutting off abruptly. Then silence again, the nightmare silence of a forest that had swallowed a scream and given nothing back. I packed my camp in darkness, throwing things haphazardly into my backpack, no longer caring about organization or sense. The fearful realization had settled into my bones that I had made a terrible mistake by coming here, by turning that radio on, by engaging with whatever was trying to communicate through it. I started walking out of the forest, following what I thought was the direction back to the main trail, moving through absolute darkness, guided only by the thin beam of my flashlight. That's when I heard it again, the radio, but I destroyed it. I smashed it and removed the batteries and thrown it into the darkness. I knew I had, yet that familiar sound of voices was unmistakable, and it was coming from ahead of me, deeper into the forest, not behind me where I left the wreckage. The unsettling truth was that there was another radio, or perhaps there had always been another radio, and what I destroyed was just one of many. I stopped walking. My hands were shaking so badly the beam of my flashlight danced across the trees like something alive. The voices from this new radio were different. They weren't reading town names anymore. They were reading something else. Numbers, long sequences of coordinates, latitudes and longitudes, locations that must have meant something to whoever was receiving this broadcast, or whatever was receiving it. The terrifying implication crashed over me like a wave. The radio wasn't trying to communicate with me. I was just in the area, just in the wrong place at the wrong time. There was a larger communication happening, something vast and incomprehensible, and I'd simply been fortunate enough to stumble onto a fragment of it. The creepy certainty that these broadcasts had been going on for years, maybe decades, maybe longer, in this stretch of Pennsylvania forest, and I did just become aware of them. I ran. I crashed through the darkness, branches slashing at my face, my flashlight beam bouncing uselessly off tree trunks and undergrowth. The horrifying thing about running through a forest in complete darkness is that you have no idea if you are getting closer to safety or running deeper into danger. I had no way of knowing. I just ran, guided only by the desperate hope that the trail was ahead of me, that civilization was ahead of me, that something human and rational existed beyond this nightmare forest. The voices followed me, not the radio this time, but voices themselves, carried on the wind or manifesting directly in my mind. I couldn't tell. The eerie quality of them was unmistakable, though. They were calling out coordinates, listing locations, and some of the locations they were naming were ones I recognized. My hometown, my street, my address, the disturbing certainty that they were homing in on me, triangulating my position, using my presence as a reference point, made every muscle in my body seize with primal fear. I burst out of the forest onto a service road just before dawn. A pickup truck was parked there, engine still running, headlights on. The truck was empty, the driver, his door hung open. On the dashboard, I could see the faint glow of an emergency radio, and even from a distance of 20 feet, I could hear the voices speaking through it. The shadowy outline of the forest pressed in behind me, and the creepy realization that I just barely escaped something that lived in those trees, something that communicated through radios, something that was hunting or gathering or surveying in ways that human minds aren't equipped to understand. I got in the truck and drove. I didn't go to the police. I didn't tell anyone what I experienced. The terrifying part is that I am not even sure how to explain it in a way that makes sense. I sound insane. I know I sound insane, but I kept the emergency radio I found in that truck. It's been sitting on my desk for 3 weeks now, and every single night, no matter how many times I remove the batteries, it turns itself on. The voices are always reading, always listening, always naming coordinates and towns and locations scattered across Pennsylvania and the surrounding states. The horrifying truth I've come to accept is that whatever is broadcasting these messages ISN to trying to communicate with me specifically, I am just incidental, just someone who happened to be in the wrong place and had the misfortune of turning on a radio at the exact moment the transmission was active. But here, it's the chilling thing that keeps me awake at night. There are people missing in Pennsylvania, dozens of them over the past 30 years, maybe more. Hikers who didn't come back, campers who vanished without a trace, hunters found dead in ways that couldn't be explained by any animal, their bodies positioned as if they'd been placed there deliberately, as if they'd been marked or cataloged or stored for some purpose. The eerie pattern of disappearances follows a geographic distribution that almost matches the coordinates being read out on that radio. And the unsettling part is that new locations are being added every night. I just started keeping a log of the coordinates the radio reads out. They've been mapping them on a map of Pennsylvania, and they form a pattern. A grid. An organized, methodical grid overlaid across hundreds of square miles of forest and rural areas. The terrifying implication is that something is surveying this region, marking locations for reasons I can to comprehend, using those radios as some kind of communication network or beacon system that exists just outside normal human perception. The most disturbing aspect of all this is what I discovered in my research. There are online forums, hidden communities of people who experienced similar things. People who found radios in abandoned cabins, in old farmhouses, in forgotten places throughout Pennsylvania's wilderness. People who heard the voices and the coordinates and the lists of towns. Some of them have gone missing since posting their accounts. Their last messages are all the same. They decided to go back into the forest. They want to understand what the radios mean. They want to find the source. None of them have ever come back to post a follow-up. The creepy sensation that I am being observed, that my coordinates have been added to whatever list is being broadcast on that radio, never fully goes away. I lock my doors. I keep my house well lit. I drive during daylight hours when possible. But the fearful knowledge that something in Pennsylvania, as forests, is aware of my location, is possibly aware of your location, is surveying and mapping and marking in ways that we can to begin to comprehend, sits in the back of my mind every single moment. And that radio is still talking. Even now, as I'm telling you this story, Even though I haven't activated the batteries, even though the radio is in a sealed box in my basement, I can hear it. Just faintly, just barely at the edge of perception. The eerie voices reading coordinates, reading town names, reading the lists of whatever they recataloging in those dark Pennsylvania forests. If you ever go camping in Pennsylvania, if you ever venture into the wilderness there, and you find an emergency radio, do yourself a favor. Don't turn it on. Don't let curiosity get the better of you. The horrifying truth is that some things are trying to communicate with us across distances and frequencies that shouldn't, to work, using methods we don't understand. The terrifying reality is that they still out there, still broadcasting, still mapping, still surveying. And every night, they re-adding new coordinates to their list. Every night, they remarking new locations, new people, new areas of the forest where the boundary between our world and theirs grows just a little bit thinner. The nightmarish certainty is that eventually, they will have marked everywhere. Eventually, no place will be safe. Eventually, those radios will stop broadcasting coordinates and start broadcasting something else entirely. And when that happens, when they stop listing locations and start listing names, that is when the real horror will begin. That is when we understand what those surveys were for. That is when we finally, terrifyingly, comprehend what they've been planning all along in the shadowy darkness between those ancient Pennsylvania trees. Story 10. Ranger report never released. I found the document 3 weeks ago, buried in a storage unit in Harrisburg that nobody wanted. The terrifying thing about truth is that sometimes it finds you, even when you were not looking for it. Especially when powerful people have spent decades making sure you never see it. My name is Marcus Webb. I am a government contractor who clears out abandoned federal storage facilities. Boring work, mostly moldy boxes and outdated equipment. But last month, while cataloging a unit that belonged to the Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, I discovered a file that was never supposed to exist. The label read, Incident Report the 14th of October 1987. Ranger Thomas Hickman, Sector 7, Michaud State Forest. Classified. I shouldn't have opened it. I should have followed protocol and turned it over to my supervisor. But something about that word, classified, made my hands shake as I broke the seal. What could a park ranger possibly document that required government secrecy? The report was handwritten. 12 pages of increasingly frantic notes. Hickman's penmanship deteriorated as the pages went on, transforming from neat professional script into barely legible scrawls. The first entry was dated October 1st, 1987. It described something Hickman called unidentified movement patterns inconsistent with wildlife. He denoticed it during routine patrol, unusual disturbances in the undergrowth that followed a path too deliberate to be animal behavior. The tracks, if you could call them that, appeared and disappeared randomly. They defied logic. Hickman measured them, photographed them, tried to document everything with scientific precision. But the photographs weren't in the file. Someone had removed them. The empty sleeves remained, marked with dates and locations, but every single image was gone. The eerie part was Hickman's increasing desperation to understand what he was witnessing. By October 7th, he wrote about the silence, how certain sections of the forest had become completely quiet. No birds, no insects, no wind, just oppressive, disturbing stillness that made his skin crawl. On October 10th, he described finding trees that had been marked. Not by animals or humans. The bark was stripped in patterns that looked almost deliberate, almost like symbols. He sketched them in the margins. Looking at those drawings made my eyes hurt, like they were shapes my brain couldn't quite process. October 12th, Hickman wrote about the watching. He felt eyes on him constantly during his patrols. He'd spin around, weapon drawn, and find nothing. But the sensation never left. Something was tracking him through those Pennsylvania woods, learning his routes, studying his patterns. The final entry, dated October 14th, was where everything fell apart. Hickman had set up motion-activated cameras throughout Sector 7, trying to capture evidence of whatever was moving through his forest. The cameras triggered repeatedly over 3 nights, always between 2 and 4 a.m. But when he reviewed the footage, the screen showed only static. Not darkness, not animals, pure static, like something was interfering with the electronics, except in one frame. He described it in detail that made my blood run cold. For exactly 1 second, the static cleared. The image showed the forest at night, illuminated by infrared, and in the center of the frame stood something that Hickman couldn't identify. He wrote that it had a shape that seemed wrong, proportions that didn't match any known animal or human. It appeared to be looking directly at the camera. Looking at him, the next morning, all 6 cameras were gone. Not stolen, not broken, simply vanished from locations Hickman had secured with steel cables and padlocks. That is when he filed the official report to his supervisors. That is when everything changed. The final page was a handwritten note, not by Hickman but by someone else. The handwriting was different, more official. It stated that Ranger Thomas Hickman had requested immediate leave for personal health reasons. His resignation was accepted effective October 21st, 1987. The matter was closed. The report was classified under administrative review. I stared at those words for a long time, sitting in that storage unit surrounded by forgotten government files. The fear started creeping in then, the realization that someone had buried this intentionally. Someone wanted Hickman's discovery erased. I did what anyone would do. I started searching for Thomas Hickman. The disturbing truth is that he disappeared. Not officially. His record showed he moved to Ohio after resigning, then Colorado, then Nevada. But I couldn't find any trace of him after 1992. No death certificate, no social media presence, no property records, nothing. It was like he simply walked off the edge of the world. I became obsessed. I drove to Michaud State Forest, to Sector 7 where Hickman had conducted his patrols. The area was still there, still accessible, though the trails seemed less maintained than other parts of the forest. Like people avoided this section without knowing why. I hiked in during late afternoon, carrying copies of Hickman's sketches and GPS coordinates from his notes. The forest felt normal at first, just trees and fallen leaves and the smell of pine. But as I went deeper, following Hickman's old patrol route, that silence he described began settling around me. It was gradual. The bird calls faded. The rustling of small animals in the undergrowth stopped. Even the wind seemed to die, leaving an eerie, unnatural quiet that pressed against my eardrums. Then I found the trees. They were exactly where Hickman's map indicated, a cluster of old oaks with stripped bark showing those same strange patterns he sketched. Except now, 37 years later, the markings had spread. More trees bore the symbols. They degrown, expanded, like some kind of horrifying infection spreading through the forest. My phone died. Full battery 1 second, completely dead the next. My GPS watch stopped working. Even my flashlight flickered and went dark. I was standing in a forest in Pennsylvania in broad daylight, and suddenly I couldn't see properly. The shadows between the trees seemed thicker than they should be, darker, like they were made of something more substantial than the absence of light. That is when I felt the watching. It was exactly like Hickman described, an overwhelming sensation of eyes boring into my back, studying me with inhuman intelligence. I spun around, and there was nothing visible, but the feeling intensified. Whatever was out there had been waiting for someone to come back, waiting for someone to remember. I ran. I am not proud of it, but I crashed through that forest like a scared animal, branches tearing at my clothes, roots trying to trip me. The silence followed me, a bubble of wrong that moved with me through the trees. And behind it, I heard something else. Not footsteps, not any sound I could identify, just the sense of movement, of something large and deliberate tracking me through the undergrowth. I made it back to my car as the sun was setting. My hands shook so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I pulled away, I looked in the rearview mirror at the tree line. Something stood at the edge of the forest, barely visible in the fading light. The same wrong proportions Hickman had described. The same sense of something that shouldn't exist. It didn't move. It just watched as I drove away, heading back towards civilization and safety. That was 2 weeks ago. Since then, I've been digging deeper. I found other reports, other rangers who worked in Pennsylvania state forests over the decades. 3 of them had resigned suddenly in the 90s. 2 more in the early 2000s. All from different forests. All citing personal reasons. All their incident reports mysteriously missing or classified. I contacted the families of the rangers I could identify. Most wouldn't talk to me, but one daughter agreed to meet, off the record. Her father had been a ranger at Rothrick State Forest in 1996. She told me he changed after something he saw on patrol, became paranoid, started drinking, insisted something was living in the deep woods that the government knew about but wouldn't acknowledge. He told her about movement patterns, about cameras that failed, about the creeping silence and the sensation of being studied by something vast and patient. He filed a report. 2 weeks later, he resigned. 5 years after that, he died in a car accident on a clear day on a straight road with no other vehicles involved. The chilling detail she shared was what he told her the night before he died. He said the things in the forest were getting bolder, that they'd been content to stay hidden for decades, maybe centuries. But something was changing. They were being seen more often. Moving closer to human settlements, testing boundaries. She asked him what they wanted. He said he didn't know, but he had a terrifying theory. Maybe they'd always been there, in the oldest forests, in the dark places humans rarely went. Maybe they learned to avoid us, to stay in the shadows. But as we pushed deeper into their territory with our trails and campgrounds in development, maybe we were forcing a confrontation neither side was prepared for. I think about Hickman's report constantly, about those cameras that vanished, about the thing captured for 1 second in infrared, about all the rangers who saw something and were silenced, one way or another. Last night, I heard something outside my apartment. I live in downtown Harrisburg now, miles from any forest. But at 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of something moving on my fire escape. Not footsteps, that same indefinable sound of movement that doesn't match anything natural. When I looked out the window, I saw shadows in the alley below that seemed darker than they should be. Shadows that moved independently of any light source. My security camera footage from last night shows nothing but static from 2:15 to 4:30 a.m. I've made copies of Hickman's report and hidden them in multiple locations. If something happens to me, I want people to know. I want someone to understand that there are things in the Pennsylvania forests that we don't to talk about, that powerful people don't want acknowledged. The most disturbing part is what I found yesterday. I was searching through more storage files, looking for any reference to Hickman or similar incidents. I found a memo from 1988, marked eyes only. It was a directive to all state forest supervisors about handling reports of unusual wildlife activity. The memo stated clearly that any reports describing patterns inconsistent with known animal behavior should be classified immediately. Rangers filing such reports should be offered early retirement or transfer. Under no circumstances should the public be made aware of ongoing observations in designated monitoring zones. Monitoring zones. They have a name for these areas. They know. They've known for decades. I keep thinking about Hickman, wherever he is now. Did he spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder? Did the fear ever fade, or did it grow worse with time? Did he regret filing that report, or was he relieved to finally tell someone the truth? Tomorrow, I'm supposed to meet with a journalist who specializes in government cover-ups. I'm going to give her everything. The report, the names, the locations, all of it. Maybe nothing will come of it. Maybe the story gets buried like all the others. But at least someone else will know. It's 9 p.m. now. 6 hours until my meeting. I triple locked my door and moved my desk against it for good measure. My phone is fully charged. My car keys are in my pocket. I'm not taking chances. But I keep looking at the window, at the darkness outside, and wondering if it makes any difference. If something followed me out of those woods, if something has been watching me since I found that report, then locks and plans and meetings matter. The scary truth is that we share this world with things we don't understand. Things that hide in the old places, the forgotten places, the forests that existed before we built our cities and roads. And sometimes, when someone gets too close to the truth, those things remind us that we're not really in control. I hear something now, outside in the hallway. Footsteps that don't sound quite right. Too heavy, too deliberate. They stopped outside my door. The lights just flickered. If you, re-listening to this, if someone finds these notes, remember Ranger Thomas Hickman. Remember all the others who saw something in the Pennsylvania forests and tried to warn us. Remember that their reports were classified for a reason. And whatever you do, don't go looking in Sector 7 of Michaud State Forest. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. The doorknob is turning now, even though it is locked. I hope the journalist gets my files. Pennsylvania's forests are quiet for a reason. If you want more true horror stories like these, subscribe to Vesper Shroud. New stories every week, and some places should never be revisited.